message me directly, like I said, or Jason, but I will be able to respond probably sooner. We do have a break built in. You didn't see that on your previous agenda, but we just wanted to give people a heads up so that if you want to plan for that at about 1:30, and our goal is probably to wrap up around 4, depending upon how much discussion we do have. At this time, if anybody has any questions, feel free to raise their hand or post in chat. Otherwise, I will turn it over to Jason.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Howell. I am the public lands advocate for Pinelands Preservation Alliance. And I'd like to welcome you all to the meeting, and I thank you for joining. And I would also like to welcome our keynote speaker, who is George Worthner. He's an ecologist, a wildlands activist, and a writer. And one of the books he helped put together is Thrillcraft, which is just an amazing book documenting some of the issues that we have experienced on public lands. There's great photographs and really great works by many different authors within the book on how off-road vehicles has affected many lands, mostly throughout the West, but also in the East Coast, where Pinelands Preservation Alliance is based in New Jersey. And George has an undergraduate degree in wildlife biology and botany, a master's degree in science communications from the University of California. And George has worked as a biologist, a wilderness ranger, and a range conservationist for the federal government. And more recently, he's been a university instructor, a photography instructor, consulting biologist, and a wildlife policy analyst. And his photographs have appeared in hundreds of publications, and George has published 36 books dealing with natural history and environmental topics. So I'd like to welcome George and invite him to speak now. So I'm going to ask you to unmute, George.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Okay. I've been trying to get a PowerPoint to work, and it for some reason won't work on my laptop right now. So I'm going to have to sort of wing it. Let me kind of begin with some of the main themes that I was trying to get across in the Thrillcraft book. One is that Thrillcraft, of course, as a form of recreation, has a greater impact on public lands than other forms of recreation, particularly to the ecosystems as well as to other recreational users. So there's this disproportionate effect. For example, one of the studies that I was hoping my PowerPoint would show you, but demonstrated, for example, in Montana, and by the way, as a preference, I was saying most of my information is in the West because that's where I live. But in Montana, 90% of the people who use public land trails are hiking. Another 8% are on horseback, and the number used by various kinds of thrillcraft is only 2 to 3%. And so, and if you ask in that same survey, are you bothered by, if you ask the thrillcraft users, are you bothered by hikers? They'll usually say no. However, if you ask the hikers if they're bothered, they are bothered by the noise and speed, etc., and feel somewhat threatened by it. So, so that's one of the problems with it. The other thing is just the idea, and this is sort of a thing I want to throw out there, is that the impacts, the ecological impacts, the displacement of wildlife. For example, in another study in Montana, it was found that elk, if there's more than a mile of trail use, will displace 25% of the elk won't use that area. If you get more than 6 miles of trail in a square mile, the elk are completely gone. That is an impact that is seldom considered, how a lot of sensitive wildlife are disturbed. And in a sense, if you consider, excuse me, that on either side of a trail, you have a zone of influence, you can call it, that where these animals tend to not utilize it. They're losing a lot of habitat out of it. For example, grizzly bears in Montana will avoid up to a mile on either side of a trail that has a significant amount of ORV use. And so, if you look at the fact that a lot of, in the West at least, you're talking about mountain valleys that are steep on the sides, and then, the only real habitat for a lot of wildlife is in the bottom. That use will displace the animals on both sides of that trail. So this you can consider, in my view, a form of vandalism, because if you were to go out on public lands and trash a sign or something, you could get arrested for it. And yet here we are, we're allowing people to do significant ecological impact, and it's considered okay. So I want to change the way people think about these impacts, and recognize that it is a disproportionate kind of thing. Another sort of to answer the typical assertions you get is that, I need my ORV. By the way, I hope everybody knows when I say ORV, that means off-road vehicle. ATV is all-terrain vehicle. These are different terms for dirt bikes, snowmobiles, four-wheelers, any kind of machine access. And so people using ORV say, I need to drive my four-wheeler in order to have access, and that it's only the elitists who are against this. But to just walk a trail, all you need is a pair of sneakers. It doesn't cost much. By comparison, a lot of these machines that cost thousands and thousands of dollars, especially when you get all the rigging that goes with it, the trailers, the pickup truck to pull it, etc. And in reality, and it surprised me when I learned this, that the average owner of ORVs is sort of a middle income person. It's not, and it makes sense when you think about how much it costs to utilize these machines. So the people that are genuinely poor may be displaced by these machines trying to utilize public lands. Another factor that has been shown in studies is that there's what I call an outlaw mentality. The outlaw mentality is that even though places are closed to ORV use, there's a real tendency among many in the ORV crowd to ignore those closures, and much more so than, if Audubon members or something like that are hiking a trail. So that means that even if you have places that are closed for a variety of reasons, maybe to protect sensitive wildlife or plants or something like that, it may not be effective just putting a sign up. It is so common to see where ORVers have gone around gates, anything else, fences, designed to limit their use. And there's a very significant amount. One study, I think it was in Utah, found that 50% of the ORV users say they regularly go off trail where they're not supposed to. It's a very common feature. The other thing that happens, and it's sort of related, what the bad thing about that is, if a new trail is created, the next person comes along and thinks it's okay to go there. In other words, even if they genuinely would not normally trespass or violate a closure, once a pathway is created, then it becomes a new route. And what you have is this ever expanding system of routes and trails that have these impacts that I mentioned, like disturbing wildlife or causing water pollution from sediments, etc. And the problem with that ever-growing system is that it's very difficult to close them once they get started, because people assume that that's a legal pathway. Even those who are not necessarily, quote, outlaws and who would normally follow any regulations. Another problem that you have with, at least here in the West, with the ORV usage, is that many of the people that are adherents, they say it's our right to do this. The extreme case, not that they were advocates of ORVs, but the Bundy standoff at the Malheur Refuge is a good example of the mentality. In other words, it's public land, therefore I'm the public, I should be allowed to do anything I want there. So there's not the sense that there's an obligation or a responsibility to follow the rules and to be conscious of how your use of the land might be affecting other people as well as the wildlife. And one of the real problems also with the ORV mentality, I might call it, or whatever, besides the outlaw mentality, is this idea of speed. And this is one of the things that other users are offended by it. The speed makes it much more dangerous to be on the same trail. After a while, if there's enough ORV use, it displaces other users besides displacing the wildlife, because you don't want to be on that particular trail or route. And it can be other factors too. Like in the West, we have a lot of snowmobile use, and the snowmobiles are loud. You can hear a snowmobile up to 5 miles from a trail. And so that disturbs, a lot of people go out in the wintertime to sort of savor the quiet. Well, that quietude is ruined by the ORV use, and for a very long distance from the trails. There's a problem of air pollution too. A really surprising factor I read down in California, where they found that your typical two-stroke engine, which is common in snowmobiles, not so much in all the other ORVs, but anyway, puts out as much pollution in 7 hours as driving a car 100,000 miles. It's really surprising how much air pollution can come out. And there's also water pollution from, for example, jet skis and so forth. And 20 to 30% of the gasoline just winds up in the water. And with snowmobiles, you probably don't have this in the Pine Barrens that much because you're far enough south, but further north in the Northeast, and in the West, where there's snowmobiles happen, a lot of the gasoline is leaked from the snowmobiles into the snow. And then you have this flush in the springtime when all the snow melts, and then you suddenly have these toxic chemicals sometimes impacting the plant life because it's much more concentrated when it suddenly gets released. And there are other problems associated, a lot of smaller animals and amphibians, turtles, and so forth, that will avoid areas where there's extensive ORV use, just simply because they don't want to try to cross the trails or can't safely because they might get hurt. And part of the other issues here is is that the ability of ORVs to travel much further in a single day. For example, it's found that the average snowmobiler, again using the West, but travels between 100 and 300 miles in a single day. And dirt bikers, etc., maybe not quite that many miles. But in other words, I'll use the example of disturbance of elk. A hiker disturbs elk too, usually at a smaller distance from a trail, but you do have an impact. But because you can only hike so many miles in a day, you have to be a pretty good hiker to hike more than 15 or 20 miles on a trail. But an ORV can cover that in half an hour or an hour. And in the course of a day, they will impact far more of the terrain because of the distances they can cover. And so one of the issues is that the mechanical access, again, amplifies the impacts because of the amount of terrain that can be covered by these vehicles in a short amount of time. And there are other uh, issues about how it also creates access for poachers, people that for I don't know how much of this goes on in New Jersey. Maybe dumping illegal chemicals or something. You could take them on a trail far and dump them out in the woods. But anyway, I used to hear that about the mob. You would dump chemicals in places. Anyway, the point being is that there's access created to lands that otherwise would not be accessible to regular motor vehicles, and that becomes a problem. So what can be done? Well, it's interesting. At least some public lands, for example, the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire has banned ORVs entirely on the forest everywhere. In the Adirondack Mountains, Adirondack State Park has banned ORVs on any trails. You can go on roads in the state forest lands there, but not on the trails. And there's been a campaign for quiet waters started in various places to try to eliminate motorboats and jet skis and so forth from lakes and other areas. For example, in Oregon, the second largest lake in the whole state of Oregon, motors were banned on it, which was quite amazing. And the justification for it was it has some of the cleanest water in the state of Oregon. You can see 130 feet down, it's so clear. So it's like distilled water. So they wanted to keep it from being polluted. So that's how they were able to sort of finagle this ban on motors on that lake. But what I have seen is that unless you have a lot of enforcement, it's difficult to keep these machines banned. Now, one of the problems, and I don't know if this is the case in the Pine Barrens, but in a lot of places where ORVs are still permitted, there's two ways you can approach it, and the one way is far less effective. One way you can say, if a trail is closed, it'll be signed as closed and everything else is open. Well, the problem with that is somebody comes along and rips off the sign and then suddenly it's open. So a way that has been approached is to do the opposite approach, which is close it. Unless there's a sign saying it's open, you have to interpret that it's closed. That's much more effective because it's, nobody wants to rip down an open sign if they want to use it. And if it doesn't say open, then they're not allowed to use it. And that makes it a lot easier for enforcement too, because if somebody is caught on those areas, they don't have much excuse. Another problem is identification of violators. I don't know how it is in New Jersey, but in places like Montana, where I live most of the time, there's no requirement to have stuff like dirt bikes or ATVs have licenses on them. So I've got pictures I've taken of guys riding up trails on their dirt bikes, but they got their helmets on. There's no way to identify who they are. I mean, I show them to the Forest Service law enforcement, and they're like, well, there's nothing we can do about it because we don't know who these people are. So one suggestion has been to require basically a license plate on all off-road vehicles, which if it's at least there, you have some chance to identify somebody who's violating. And that could be, you can put these trail cameras out too, right at the beginning of trails that are problematic. And if you had those license plates on there, you might be able to identify people more readily. Another problem is the fines are often pretty insignificant. I've seen interviews with ORVers saying, well, if it's a $50 fine for violating this thing, I'll just pay it because I want to ride there anyway. And the chances that I'll get caught are so insignificant that I'm not going to worry about it. So, and what's a fair thing to do? I mean, it would be outrageous to fine $10,000 or something like that. But there certainly has to be some way to make it more painful than a $25 or a $50 fine for violations. Otherwise, it continues. And another a way to deal with it, of course, is to put up barriers. They're only effective to a certain degree, but you will see a lot of places where big boulders are placed so that you can't really get a machine through there, and maybe dig deep holes and so forth at the beginning of a trail that makes it difficult to get through. They're only partially effective, but at least if anybody goes across that, they can't claim that they didn't know they shouldn't be going there, for one thing, sign or no sign. And the other good thing about that is the honest, you might say, person that's out there will not violate those kinds of closures, and they're less likely to do that. But I've seen, again, using the West as an example, I always had my PowerPoint. There's like, I have pictures of these sign roads, the trails there. They have this like one skinny plastic post that you can bend that says, no ATVs here. And it's like you can just move all around it. You can drive right over it and the thing bends even if you wanted to. That kind of signage is just totally ineffective. And one district ranger who I've worked with in Montana, who is sympathetic, he's done a really nice job. One of the things that he did, first of all, at a trailhead, he has a big sign saying, the closures, and particularly one trail there, it is legal to use ORVs on, but they start at the same trailhead. So it's very clear which trail is legal and which isn't from this big sign. And then on the trail that it is illegal on, he has a sign at the beginning about 100 feet up the trail saying, closure. And then he has another sign like another half a mile up the trail, and then a third sign even more up that, and this is signs that are all metal with cement in the ground. It's really hard to get rid of or take care. So and that way, you can, if you want to give people the benefit of the doubt, they maybe missed the first sign or they didn't read the map. But after they pass 3 signs, it's obvious that they are ignoring it. So sometimes you have to do that repetition to be able to make sure that what you're doing is effective. And the other thing is that plays against things. Again, I don't know if this is true in New Jersey, but in a lot of Western states, there's a tax on gasoline that is used to build more ORV trails. And of course that, and they're built on public lands. And so that is an ever increasing, a way that ever increasing the impact of ORVs on these lands because they're building more and more trails. One solution, if you have that issue, is to try to at least have concentrated areas. This is the idea of sacrifice zones. In California, for example, there's a whole bunch of state ORV parks that the state park system has. And the idea is to try to concentrate the damage basically to one area. And if people have those areas, they're less likely then to violate and go into other areas. That's the assumption. And it probably does work to some degree. But modifying that tax, the way it's divvied up among different user groups. Now, there's a small percentage of it also goes for building hiking trails, for example, but the larger percentage goes for anything run by gasoline. And the logic they use is, well, it's a gasoline tax, so therefore it should go towards gasoline-powered vehicles. Another issue that, yes.
I was just going to say, you have some great information on your website. If you'd like, while you're talking for a few more minutes, I could share screen so people can see it.
That'd be wonderful. One other thing that I would suggest too is that's going to be a new problem in the future, is that electric vehicles are going to become more available. And generally, I think that's a good thing. But But one of the issues with the electric vehicles is that a lot of the impacts will still be the same, but it may not be as noisy or polluting, which would be a good thing to a degree. But it still won't deal with all these other issues of the distances you can travel and just, like the displacement I talked about, grizzly bears and elk. The reason they're displaced is not because of the noise per se. It's the theory is anyway, is that these machines are moving fast. An animal like an elk or a deer reacts negatively to fast movement because that's what a predator does when it's coming towards them. So if they see fast movement, and a lot of times they may not be able to identify exactly what is moving fast, they just know it's moving fast, therefore I better move away. So you'll still have that with electric vehicles, even if they become the predominant use, electric dirt bikes, etc. And as an aside, and I don't know if this is something you wanted me to discuss, but we have this increasing use of where technology, it's like coevolution, how whales become like the shape of fish, right? So we're having the same thing with mountain bikes, where with electric mountain bikes, for example, they're becoming more and more like a dirt bike and have, again, the same, and mountain bikes in general, because they can travel a long way, often have similar impacts to ORVs. And that's another issue in a lot of Western areas where trails on a lot of national forests are open to mountain biking, but not ORVs. But now that electric mountain bikes are around, is that what do you do about that? Is that still a mountain bike or is that a ORV? And so this is going to be an issue that somebody's going to have to resolve in the future, and it hasn't. It's just sort of happening. And my feeling is that the way to do it is if you're going to just basically exclude mountain bikes from any trail where you don't want to have those conflicts, because it's going to be impossible to say that this bike is a mountain bike. The batteries are smaller and smaller, and then people also say, well, I wasn't using the battery when I was on the trail, so I was not motorized. Well, you were, maybe. So anyway, I'll tell you what, I'm going to just end it there and be open for questions, because I'm just trying to work off on my memory here, and I'm not as organized as I would be if I had a PowerPoint.
That's great, George. Thank you very much for presenting all that information. I think it was very useful. So everyone, feel free to ask questions now. What are your questions for George and about the topic in general? And feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask a question. I could start us off, George. This clearly was a monumental effort putting this book together. Could you say, how you got started doing this?
Well, at the time, I was working for Doug Tompkins, who some of you may have heard of. He used to own North Face and Esprit clothing, and he took his money and went to Patagonia and started buying up lands, and eventually accumulated enough lands that he donated to the countries of Chile and Argentina. And he died kayaking in Patagonia about 5 years ago. But what would happen, why I had this amazing job with him, which was I would just suggest, let's do a book on something, and he would basically say, yeah, go ahead. And so at the time, particularly, there was a lot of issues about public lands, ORV use, and so the way it would work with the different books I did for Doug is, I'd start traveling around to, let me step back. Before I started working for Doug, I was a freelance writer and photographer. So I did that for work. So I would start traveling around the country to take pictures, learn about the impacts, find other writers who could contribute chapters to the book. And then we would solicit additional photographs as well, and try to pull this stuff all together. And we usually have at the beginning of the book some main themes that we want to get across, and we try to use photographs and captions. And I spent a lot of time writing captions. You know, what I mean by that is paying attention to what was in the captions, trying to make the captions effective. Because our assumption was, you know, the majority of people aren't going to read every chapter in the book, but they'll probably thumb through and look at the pictures and read the captions. So getting across the message in the photos and in the captions was the way to try to get across these ideas in a way that most people are going to find it accessible. And so that's one of I can tell some amusing stories from my travels. One, you know, I'd go to these sites where there was a lot of ORV users, and I tried to blend in because I want to take photographs of, you know. So I had a pickup truck, not a big one like a lot of people had, but I had a pickup truck, so that sort of gave me a little, you know, like I was probably an okay guy. And I had like NRA bumper stickers, you know, and kill wolves because they're, you know, they're killing the elk, and they were metallic, so that I could put them on just when I was driving into the parking lots, and then I could take them off when I wasn't there. And then I would always. I noticed I did an informal survey. This is going to sound probably not so good, but I'm going to tell you about an informal survey, which is that most ORV users at these sites drink cheap beer. And so I would always have, you know, really cheap beer cans. And as I get out of my car, I kick them out to the ground. And then, you know, and I didn't pick them up until after I left, but I'd let them sit there on the ground. And anyway, and you know, I'd have an NRA hat or something on, and then when I would go out there, I'd ask these guys if I could take their pictures, and most of them were just really anxious to have their pictures taken. You know, in fact, they might go around in a circle and come back a couple of times to make sure I got a good one. So they're very proud of what they were doing, and it was interesting to see that. And the other thing that I tried to do in researching the book, of course, was contact land managers in various agencies like the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, the Park Service, any place, state parks, where they had issues. And a surprising percentage would tell you that that was a big problem for them. And it was a problem that they felt wasn't adequately funded for them to deal. Like, for example, I think one statistic I remember, the BLM had one ranger for every 1,000,000 acres under their control in California. So, you know, when you have that limited law enforcement, it's basically not there at all. And
I just posted, George. I mean, you have great statistics here.
yeah,
You can see
yeah.
for all the surveys and things that you did on your book. So this is good. I'm just showing it for people now. Also, somebody on YouTube had posted a question. They had wanted to know whether or not the electric of these vehicles, were you saying that's going to be a requirement?
No, I was saying that will become problematic in the future, because a lot of the regulations that exclude ORVs, they base it on the exclusion that they're gasoline powered vehicles. And and that's like, I'll use, as I mentioned, the mountain bike example. So e-bikes, electric bikes, it's in this zone right now where there's really nobody knows what, you know, how are we going to deal with this? Are they a motorized thing like a dirt bike, or are they more a mountain bike? And in some places they feel like if it's just a mountain bike, it's okay to use on a trail, and if it's not like an e-bike, it's not. So that's all I'm saying, is that it's a new issue that's, you know, on the horizon.
I see. Thank you for that clarification. And somebody else had a question. Russell, I don't know if you want to ask it or I can.
Yeah, I'd like to know, George, if you have any experience with two problems that we seem to have here in New Jersey. One is complicity and sympathy on the part of law enforcement officers we hear all the time from riders that, hey, nobody's going to stop us. The cops are riding with us, And then we hear things when we try to get law enforcement officers to enforce the law, they're very reluctant to do so. And then the other issue is that, we don't know to what extent ORV manufacturers and dealers, local dealers, are able to have an effective lobby on people that should be, helping to reduce these impacts.
Well, one of the things I have in that Trailcraft book, I'm going to respond to the second part, but a lot of the advertisement for these vehicles emphasize things like, brute force, be aggressive, go fast, destroy the land. It's sort of the mindset that's promoted by the manufacturers is this concept of, sort of conquer and control and speed, and that's what they're trying to appeal to. So I think indirectly they're promoting this kind of mentality, or at least they recognize that that's what sells the vehicles. As far as the law enforcement, I'm not surprised by what you tell me. My experience with the law enforcement on the public lands in the West, like the BLM rangers or Forest Service rangers that I've encountered, is they're not as sympathetic as the ones you're talking about. Like a typical sheriff might be sympathetic to the ORVers, but most of the people that get into law enforcement working for the federal agencies, I think, are generally concerned about trying to protect the land and other users. And at least my experience is that they are willing to try to enforce to the degree they can. But the problems, as I mentioned, like having no license plates, or the fact that they are, have a huge area that they have to work on, makes it difficult for them to do the enforcement that they might otherwise be inclined to do.
Okay, we have one question from Neil Clark from the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance. Neil, did you want to ask that now?
Sure. Thanks, George. So it feels like, 2 decades ago, there was a lot more interest and a much stronger national strategy around addressing off-road vehicles from the conservation community. And, like about the time Trailcraft came out. And in the last decade, it feels as though a lot of organizations have really walked away from this issue, while at the same time, use has really exploded. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on why you think that has occurred, and what it's going to take to sort of reinvigorate the greater conservation movement to care about off-road vehicles and to put time and resources towards trying to make some progress, especially with this administration.
Okay, that's a great question, and your observations are completely accurate. Even back when there was a little more attention, one of my criticisms was there was very few organizations that hired anybody to deal with this. There was a tangential assignment, maybe in a group now and again. In other words, what I'm getting at, you had whole national groups, whether it was the Wilderness Society, the Sierra Club or whatever, and there wouldn't be a single person whose job was to focus just on ORV use and their impacts. And that has only gotten worse, as pointed out. I have my own theories. I have no data to show this or anything, but a couple of things that I think that have happened is, and again, I don't know if this is common in New Jersey, but in the West, there has been a big rise in what are called collaboratives. And the collaboratives are where various interest groups supposedly get together to deal with public lands issues. And one of the effects of collaboratives is that if you're a member of the collaborative, you don't want to criticize, or in fact, sometimes you have to agree that you will not criticize openly anything that the collaborative comes up with. And so a lot of organizations that in the past might have been critical of ORVs, because a lot of the collaboratives might be dealing with, say, issues of ORV access or whatever. They are sort of bought off, I might say, it might be the term, by their participation in these collaboratives, and in effect, they're ineffective in being to deal with. And of course, their argument is, well, we'll work with these folks and we can get further than if we're having lawsuits or something. But a lot of times I feel like it just sort of provides greenwashing for these kinds of issues. The other thing that drives a lot of what conservation groups do, it has to do with funding. And so if the foundations that are out there that provide a lot of funding to these organizations don't have it as a priority, I can guarantee you, we'll put it the opposite way. If suddenly foundations decided they wanted to fund, some positions for groups to have somebody working on these issues, most of those groups would be happy to have a person working on the issues. But without the funding, it gets ignored. And I don't know if you have any other ideas, but those are the things that come to mind for me.
And I know we had at least one more question. Paula?
Actually, Jason, there were a couple, but I'd asked them if they could post in chat. I think, I don't know if.
Okay. Well, I know Paula wanted to go. You want to give Paula? Can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I do have a quick question regarding laws at the state level. I'm sure they vary widely, but are there some states that are more protective in their legislation than others? And that's a separate question about rather than funding and coverage. But I'm curious to know if there are states that have laws on the books to address this problem.
I would say not really, other than specific instances, like I mentioned, the Adirondacks in New York. And the Adirondacks, as most of you probably know, has very strict laws about logging and other exploitation of their state lands in the Adirondacks. So because of that, they have strict just for the Adirondacks, and maybe they have it for the Catskills. I don't know. That's another major state park they have. But on most of the state lands, in New York, there's a distinction that it's not nearly as enforceable or laws specific to it that you would find for the Adirondacks. And I would say that tends to be the case. Most of the state parks in most states tend to be more like a national park, and so they're restricted to that. But if you have other state lands, like in the West, there's a whole lot of state lands that are leased for grazing or they're logged or whatever, and then the restrictions on those lands are non-existent usually.
Okay. And Paula, go ahead.
Do you know of anybody that's working on doing a class action suit against the manufacturers that, like they did with cigarette smoking? Is anybody taking that on?
Not that I'm aware of, but it's funny you use the cigarette smoking issue because when I was doing this book, I had a lot of people saying, you're never going to get any changes, because there's so much money from the manufacturers pushing this stuff and so many people that are utilizing this stuff. But I do make the analogy of smoking that, if you in the 1950s had said to anybody, I'm going to try to start a campaign to get smoking banned in public places, they would have told you, are you crazy? That'll never work. And here we are today where, of course, you can't smoke in public places, any place. And so not to get discouraged by that, it takes time, but you can change the public perception. And And, I try to use this word, it may seem harsh, but I call it vandalism when they're doing all this damage to the public lands. And if we, and words are powerful. So if you frame the issue as vandalism, why would we allow somebody to tear up the land and with no consequences? But if, they destroyed a sign in a campground or even left some litter, they might get fined. Isn't it absurd? So I think we have to change the public perception of what these things do and try to promote that idea that this is something that should be very restricted. To my mind, should be restricted only to regular gravel roads and so forth, not really off of roads, off on the trails. And that would be my goal.
All right. And with that, George, I just want to thank you for attending and presenting. I think, that was really valuable information you shared with everyone today. And for people that signed up, we're going to be sending out copies of Thrillcraft. So please do, let us know if you want a copy, if you didn't check off the box already. So yeah, thank you very much for attending, George, and feel free to stick around if you'd like. And next up, we're going to have Barry Sulkin, who's an environmental scientist. And, Barry, Barry has worked as Chief Enforcement and Compliance Officer for Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. And since then, he has created an extensive private practice as an investigator and scientist serving citizen groups and working on a wide range of water quality issues. He has more than 25 years of experience in Tennessee resource management, both in state service and private practice, and is the Tennessee Director for Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. After Barry speaks, we'll be presenting his short film, Water and Brimstone, about the damage being done by off-road vehicles in the Cumberland River watershed. So Barry, please go ahead and unmute yourself and please begin.
I think I am unmuted. Can anybody hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, so I have been working since 1990 after I left state government on a variety of issues. The four-wheeler thing, as I tend to call it, didn't come to light for me until about maybe 12, 14 years ago when I pitched an idea to Patagonia for some funding for Tennessee Pier. And I pitched several ideas. They picked up on the four-wheeler one because the store manager in Atlanta where I was meeting, she and her husband like to go fishing in the Tellico River up at the Tennessee-North Carolina border. There was a problem there. It had come to my attention through a donor who's a trout fisherman that the mud was inundating the Tellico River whenever it rained, but the North Fork that joined it was always crystal clear in the same rain. He didn't know why. We figured out it was four-wheelers. And this was on public land, curiously, in North Carolina, but it drained this pocket of the upper end of the Tellico River into Tennessee. So the activity was on National Forest in North Carolina, but it all flowed into the National Forest and then downstream into another state. And so neither state took ownership of it. And they've been fooling with it for years with a task force, touchy-feely thing with four-wheelers, putting in bridges and soft sort of thing. I brought it to the attention of Southern Environmental Law Center, who was getting into the issue. We ended up filing a notice of intent to sue, primarily for violation of the forest plan, which prescribes so many miles of roadway per acre of forest. And then we threw in some Clean Water Act violations. Right about that time, and we made Four-Wheeler Magazine as terrorist groups that were trying to take away rights of people. Actually, I saw that in an airport. We were highlighted in there. The Obama administration took over right as we were filing that lawsuit, and the Forest Service flipped to our side of the issue. They did an emergency closure and were sued by the Four-Wheeler Association, who lost. And they did a complete cleanup and closure. I went back a year or two later with Patagonia to see what they had done, and you couldn't even find the trails. They'd done such a good job of covering up these devastated areas, just huge canyons that four-wheelers had created. I then started looking around at other places, did a survey of all the sites in Tennessee. I actually even worked for a private four-wheeler park that got in trouble with the state because neighbors complained, and helped them come up with a management plan and negotiated an individual permit where they had to monitor their discharges during rain. And then a few years later, again with Patagonia's support, I was called initially on as a private consultant for a family up near Huntsville, Tennessee, adjacent to a huge private four-wheeler park called Brimstone, 19,000 plus acres. Much of it is former coal mine land that had been turned into four-wheeler playground, owned by a large timber company mostly, but leased to this private entity. And they were devastating the area and the neighbors' land, the neighbors who hired me. They had 600 acres adjacent, and mud was just flowing down on them. A stream that started on the Brimstone was the primary stream through the neighbor's property, and it was knee-deep in mud all over the place. We tried a variety of things. One thing that started taking hold was I ran into a friend of mine who had just retired involuntarily as the anchor woman of the local NBC affiliate, and she was doing documentary work. She was asking me about things I was working on, and I mentioned this to her, and she took an interest. So she and I started making trips up there. When I would go up there to document things with sampling and other things, trying to build a lawsuit, she would film it. So we ended up doing a short film. My idea was to keep it to 10 minutes. I think we're at 12, and maybe turn it into a larger film with a national perspective. But it did get some attention. We had a couple of showings at the Wild and Scenic Film Festival here. Some other people got involved, and eventually a law firm got involved. I ran into a lawyer I know at this firm who said they might be interested in the case. I have since turned it over to them, and last November they mediated and settled the case secretly. I don't know the terms of that settlement. I suspect they're not great. We had tried everything, including getting the state to do its job. Someone asked about state rules and so forth. It is illegal. I'm very comfortable saying that it is illegal under both state and federal clean water laws to run a business like this. Now, if it's on public lands, it's not a business. Just upstream from Brimstone is a public land area that I've not been to, but I'm told by the locals that it's run much better. They close it in wet seasons, and they have more restrictions on the trails. But on the private ones, and there are several, there's no regulation. My clients had called the state at least twice, had them come out. They got the reaction they were looking for, but then they did nothing. And they finally found out that the state inspectors had essentially been called off by the politicians and the higher ups when they heard the politicians saying, leave these guys alone. It's kind of like the only business in town, which is a false economy because it doesn't help much with the local economy. They got to repave the roads. Only a few people get rich off of it. But at any rate, we did settle the case. A bunch of provisions, I'm sure, about closing off the trail most closely associated with my client. Some other restrictions. I put together a list of things I wanted. The main thing I wanted was an NPDES permit, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit, individually prescribed to them with identified outfalls and monitoring requirements for both wet and dry days that would trigger when they were in violation. They had to stop activity, change behavior, put in controls. We did not get that. I never get that. I've asked for that every time I've worked on one of these. The only place that's ever happened is when I was working for a four-wheeler park, and I suggested that they voluntarily get one of those, and they did. So in preparing this matter for the attorneys, in addition to the sampling, I looked around the country to see who else was doing something, and I couldn't find anybody doing anything in the litigation world like this. I found some states oddly, West Virginia was one that had a permit for four-wheeler parks. It was under their stormwater permit system as a category of industrial. It wasn't a very robust permit, but at least it was something. And a few other states touched on it or had it included in the category. Tennessee was not doing much. They were toying with the idea of a general permit, which I don't approve of, that would cover these with best management practices and all the touchy-feely, fuzzy stuff that you can't really measure. It doesn't do much good. So until the federal government and then the states get serious about regulating these with a Clean Water Act permit, I don't see a major change. I think they'll keep on pumping out the mud and being ignored. I'd like to stop there if we can, Jason, and show the film. So we have plenty of time afterwards. It'll maybe spark some questions and give a break to look at my face.
Sure. Jacqueline, are you able to go ahead and share, or would you like me to share the film?
Good, I have it ready.
Great. Let's go into it. And this is Water and Brimstone, about the South Fork of the Cumberland River and an ATV park.
Yeah, and look for me, and I have a cameo or two.
Just yell if anything looks goofy.
This is the home that my father and his siblings were all born in. It's very precious to us. My name is Angela Morrow, and a lifelong resident of Huntsville, Tennessee.
What did the president know, and when did he know it?
It's a wonderful little town, and right now we are in the midst of the semi-annual invasion of ATVers. Welcome to Redneck Hell.
You see what just went by? Four-wheeler.
This is Saturday, and they started rolling in full force about Thursday morning. We have about 600 acres that is adjacent to the trails, a lot of which has been damaged by the ATV travel.
This used to be 4 inches thick of gravel, nice gravel.
Really?
Yeah.
At whose expense is?
This is the county road.
At the county's expense?
Yes. And I've passed them 50-foot RVs with a 30-foot toy hauler strapped behind it. So, you know, you're looking at that point, probably close to 100 feet of machine coming through these roads, these small roads.
Where's the drunk idiots I was talking about?
Oh yeah, I've been stopped trying to enter my own property.
You're kidding?
Yeah, told me I had to have a pass to ride Brimstone. Of course, I told them I didn't have to have a pass. My property's there. That you just heard was one side-by-side with speakers blasting. Imagine,
Oh, they have radios?
oh, massive radios. Massive radios. You can hear them a mile away in the woods. Of course. That, yeah. The damage on Brimstone is why you're getting all that mud and silt coming through the creek, running straight through their property and into New River. Trail 3 is was one of the main entrances of Brimstone's property, but they had a massive slide that took out the creek and basically rerouted the entire creek. And its lack of maintenance has run that creek off, and it's bad. It's bad on down the river. Instead of properly cutting in a road, removing debris, setting up silt catches, all they did was push all of the debris from the road down onto our entrance road. You're getting ready to see it right here. At one point, and we've got pictures and videos, there was a hole leading into our property that would basically eat an entire Toyota truck. When you dropped down in it, the windshield would have been about level with the ground.
It's a disaster. So even after they're all gone, the mud will continue to flow.
Do you worry at all about the land and the water getting torn up?
Well, it's all about natural effects. I mean, a lot of it's just erosion. It's not even the four-wheelers or the dirt is so compact by everybody driving over it that it's not really tearing the dirt up. It's like when there's a flood, how does all that stuff coming downstream not kill everything downstream?
Well, because there's only a flood every once in a while, not every weekend.
I know, but motor oil, gasoline, any of that kind of stuff is going to be hurting the environment.
Yeah.
Other than mud, dirt, rock, all that's natural, it's not going to hurt nothing. We go to a bunch of mud parks around the world, and we...
Is that what they call them, mud parks?
Well, this, I don't know what this is.
It's just so unbelievable. It's like something you couldn't set up.
You can't even see the bottom of my hands through the water.
Maybe once every year or two, I'll run across something this bad. Here's what I call the money shot.
Okay.
Take a bag, this container, and then let's get maybe two of these.
Okay.
2 or 3 of those. One is for total suspended solids. The other is for turbidity, which is a similar but different way to measure mud in the water. This is a turbidity meter. A beam of light is shot through the sample and it measures how much gets out the other side. It's sort of like taking the temperature of the water, you get an answer right away. States can set standards based on that. Tennessee doesn't have one. Tennessee have what's called a narrative only. It just says there shall not be too much. My colleagues and I have tried for years to get the state to change that and they won't do it.
Oh, here we go. 277.
277. If I get up there right where they're playing in the water, it'll probably be at 2,000. 370. I mean, that one's not clean, but it's dramatically different.
Okay.
It's
Runoff.
just runoff. This is runoff.
But it's running through a section of road where they can't ride because the mud hole's got it blocked.
Right.
So this is about what a stream would look like on a day like today if not for the four-wheelers. I've worked cases where the other side does their sampling when it settles and say, see, no impact. I mean, that'll clear up if nobody's out here for a while.
But that tells you nothing.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh.
It's kind of like forensics. It is forensics. It's just environmental instead of, criminal. Or maybe this is both. Normal can be anywhere from 0 if you have a pure spring gurgling out of a rock formation. You might get something close to 0, but more likely 5, 10. I think drinking water plants have to have turbidity of less than 1 unit after treatment before they can serve it to the customers. So a typical stream is going to range somewhere between 5 or 10 to 50 or 100, maybe on a rainy day. You're not getting up in the thousands unless you got something serious going on. So the highest we saw yesterday was almost 4,000. And we weren't even close to the source. We weren't where they were riding and stirring and churning. I assure you there will be denials and finger pointing at some other thing, like somebody cutting trees or some farmer plowing a field. But that was clearly a problem from the source we were watching. The mud being in a stream seems like a normal thing, and I've had people ask me, what's the big deal? It's just mud. There's nothing wrong with a pillow unless someone puts it over your face and stops you from breathing. This is the confluence of the New River on the left and Clear Fork on the right. They come together here in the park to form the big South Fork of the Cumberland River. So the name changes right here. And you can see the difference in clarity of the New River on the close side and Clear Fork. The name sort of says it all on the far side. So all the brimstone mud that we saw yesterday ends up here. Here it blends together and then moves downstream. And this area, being a park, isn't used for that type of activity. It's used for other gentler recreation, particularly kayaking, canoeing, hiking, fishing. And this will affect the fishing because what lands on the bottom smothers out the food that determines what kind of fish can live there. So even though there's great fishing in the big South Fork of the Cumberland, it's not as great as it could be, I'm sure, because of all the mud that's being dumped in here.
My dad used to tell me when I was a little girl, he'd say, now sis, whatever you do, don't you sell this place. That was about the farm on Phillips Branch. Take care of it. She said, someday people will be killing each other for what you got over here. A little bit of peace and quiet. Well, the peace and quiet kind of went out the window, but the rest of it's still there, and the idea is still there. I think people would be better off if they turned off the machines and walked a little bit and kind of let sink into them a little of that peace and quiet.
All right, that was a great film, Barry. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Welcome. I assume it generated some thoughts. I hope it did. If not, I can ramble on longer, but let's see if anybody has a question.
Yeah, let's open it up for questions. If you have a question for Barry or about the film, please ask your questions now. You can type them in chat to us, or just go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. I'll get started, Barry. What was the impetus for the creation of the film?
Well, I was trying to get attention for the family. We weren't getting anywhere filing complaints. I couldn't find a lawyer to take the case because it was too sticky. It just was not a nice, clean lawsuit. And I just wanted to get wider attention. Plus, my friend, the filmmaker, she was looking for a project that might turn into something full length. So we were running out of things to do. I could sample all day long, but I wanted a purpose. So I'd say it was 50% to get attention and maybe attract another group or an attorney or the state agency, and 50% just doing something.
Barry, this is George. Can you hear me?
I can.
If I understood what you said, I have a question about the Federal Clean Water Act. Does it cover, wouldn't it cover like sedimentation from these kinds of things? And if it doesn't, why not? And if it does, how come that isn't used more frequently?
Well, the answer is yes, it does cover this. The problem is it's not explicitly in there. It doesn't say if you do ORV activities, you have to have a permit. For example, if you're riding in public land, then there's no one to give the permit to. Maybe the park, maybe not. So it's a little harder to put your finger on. If it's on private land, if it's a for-profit business like this, it's like an amusement park. An amusement park has to have a stormwater permit under the federal program that the states, for the most part, administer, because all the runoff from areas that have fuel and so forth. A construction site has to have a stormwater permit if it's over half an acre. Certainly this would qualify under those criteria. It's just that the federal government and most states don't specifically name ORV parks as a category requiring a permit. So it's vague and it's being kept that way on purpose.
Just a comment, I know I visited Big Cypress National Preserve in Florida, which is just covered with ORV trails. And I would think that the Clean Water Act would apply there, but I don't know that anybody's tried to do that. You know, it's a national park unit. So I don't know if you know anything about that.
Not specifically that. I know it does apply everywhere. I've done the background research. It was in our lawsuit, both at the Teleco and at Big South Fork. We included a Clean Water Act violation. But when it is on public land, it makes it much more difficult to figure out who you're permitting. Now, it's possible to permit the park itself, the park management, just like if they have a sewage treatment plant at a national park for their bathrooms, that gets a Clean Water Act permit if it discharges. So it's permittable. It's just no one wants to go there in the bureaucracies. It's something they don't absolutely have to do, so they're not doing it. And it's all this touchy-feely, let's work together if people complain.
Thank you.
This is Emile DeVito, New Jersey Conservation Foundation. I'd like to explore this issue of the legality a little bit more. On public land, suppose, you know, New Jersey, for instance, in New Jersey State Forest or State Park, there's all this activity, there's erosion, there's sedimentation, there's violations of the Clean Water Act. But the landowner generally, I'm trying to see if I'm correct here. Generally, it's the landowner that's responsible for violations. So suppose a nonprofit organization was to sue the landowner for ostensibly violating the Clean Water Act, and the landowner is the state, and the state's, I think the state's defense would be, yeah, you know, there's a problem there, but we don't have the wherewithal, the funding, you know, the personnel, whatever it might be, to actually stop the problem, because the problem is being caused by people who are breaking rules, right? The rules say you can't do it. They're not saying that they permit it or they want to permit it. They're just saying you can't do it, but people do it and they don't have the funding or the ability to do anything about it. So I doubt the lawsuit would go anywhere. Now, that's complete speculation on my part, but I just like someone who might be more knowledgeable on that to respond.
Okay, and I'm not an attorney. I do expert witness work and investigation work. So I'm speaking from that perspective, having been around attorneys. On both our Teleco case and the Brimstone case, we did include federal Clean Water Act violations, and lawyers have a lot of background and authority for that. We sued both, well, at the Brimstone one, let me say this one. We sued both the owner of the land, which is the timber holding company out of Mississippi, and the operator of Brimstone Recreation. Under the Clean Water Act, you can, both the owner and the operator are liable. So if you have a private sewage treatment plant and a contract operator, both are liable. If you have a city with a sewage treatment plant discharging badly treated waste, and they have a private contractor that runs it, both can be enforced against. So the same is true here. And I would think that in any state, New Jersey or Tennessee. If the landowner is a state park agency, they are liable. So if they were letting people come into the state park with tanker trucks of sewage pumped out of septic tanks and draining them on the ground into a creek, that would be illegal. You just have to think of it in terms of a point source. And the way point source has been defined, it includes stormwater from certain activities that this would include. So you'd have to be a little creative, but that's what's kept most people at bay.
Whoops, I don't know where raise your hand is, but has any environmental organization sued a state DEP on this issue?
I don't know.
No.
I don't know.
I had a question. The Supreme Court in, I think it was 2002, made this decision about navigable waters, and they are no longer protected. Is that correct? Under the Federal Clean Water Act? And I was wondering how you felt like that affected.
That's not correct. You're talking about the Rapanos and Cabela case up in Michigan. What they said is non-navigable waters are not protected. And then you got to look at the footnotes, and the footnotes to the footnotes is a navigable water was once defined as things that support commerce. Under the Clean Water Act, it's and their tributaries. So the Clean Water Act navigable waters go all the way up to the beginning of streams where you couldn't even get a canoe, as long as it flows to a traditionally navigable water. They're not at issue here. We're not talking about isolated pockets of wetland out in a prairie that don't flow to another river. These are all flowing streams I'm working on that flow right into waters where there's fishing, swimming, and very clear protections under the Clean Water Act. So the whole navigable water issue never came up in any of this work.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
And then Matt Beaver wanted to know if there was any options for private landowners to obtain enforcement in that area, you know, whether that's from trespass or direct damage to their property.
Well, there's that option. When I met the Morrow family, they had been in a lawsuit with Brimstone for about 3 years and were stalemated. They sued, they got countersued. It was all on damage and trespass, but they were getting nowhere. They're getting hung cooked by a local court system, and it was just tied up. So when they were sent to me, it was to see if we could develop it into a Clean Water Act case. As an attorney, I worked with a lot. He ended up not taking the case, but he told them, see if this guy can figure it out in those terms. So that's where we went. It took me about 3 years to get it into the hands of an attorney who actually filed the lawsuit. And I think we only got as far as the notice of intent to sue. And I'm not sure they actually had to file the lawsuit because we got their attention, partly because we also noticed the landowner, the timber holding company, that didn't want any part of this. And all of a sudden they had a mess on their hands and a huge liability. So that caused this settlement, which I said earlier, I don't know the details of, but it can be done. It's just finding someone with the resources to do it and willingness is difficult. I looked hard.
All right. Well, unless anyone else has a quick question, Barry, I just want to thank you for joining us today and presenting and showing the film that you helped create. It was, I think, very useful. Anytime you have a very, well put together piece of, communications material, like a short film like that, it can be just so useful for helping people understand the issue, especially some of these things can be complex. So a good storyteller can really help condense an issue like this for the general public. And I think those tools are very, very much needed.
Well, I can say for my filmmaker who has a long and a very well-respected reputation as a newscaster, she was looking to do a full length. She saw the gravity of this nationwide, the industry growing, and she sought funding through Patagonia and elsewhere and never got it. So if anybody is interested in seeing this type of thing turn into more of a full length expose, I could put you in touch with her. She's probably still interested.
Great. Thank you very much, Barry. So we're going to go on a 10-minute break. Again, Barry, feel free to stay with us. We'll have more presenters coming up. After our break, we'll be doing a panel with Fred Akers of the Great Egg Harbor Watershed Association, Emile DeVito from the New Jersey Conservation Foundation, and myself from Pinelands Preservation Alliance. During the 10-minute break, we'll show another short film about a Pinelands landscape photographer who is a former trustee of Pinelands Preservation Alliance, Albert Horner. So we'll take a 10-minute break now. And Jacqueline, if you could please bring that film up. And we'll be back at 1:40.
Sorry, Jason, can you repost it in chat? Got it.
Years ago or so, I decided that I'm just going to photograph the Pinelands. Photographers who really do well and do their subjects well basically live where they photograph. I think there's a lot of raw beauty in the Pinelands, and that's what I try to photograph. And you also got to look for little intimate scenes, not this big overall picture. You've got to look for the little things that make up the Pinelands, whether it's a wetlands or a river or a lake or a pond. And I photograph almost entirely in the morning. The difference between then and the middle of the day is phenomenal. One of the biggest reactions I've gotten to my photography, and some photographers don't like the comment, but I kind of relish it. People tell me they look like paintings. If it's not art, then I don't photograph it. What ultimately happened was I became a really strong advocate for the Pinelands. And as I progressed, I realized that these photographs could be very helpful to help preserve the Pinelands and make people more understanding of what's there. I think of all the things, because of the physicalness of the off-road vehicles and the amount of destruction that only a few of them can do at any given time, that's the biggest threat to the Pinelands in my estimation now. There's one area, it's called Quarter Mile, that's been just devastated. I don't know that it'll ever return to its natural state at all. It's that bad. I realized it was an immense area. It's like 85 acres, and you can clearly see it on Google Earth. So what I did was I started a blog, and the name of the blog was The Scar. And the reason I called it that is because it appeared to be a huge scar on the land. When I finally got back there to where I wanted to photograph, I found the devastation to be so immense that I could hardly believe all this destruction that I saw. So this will never be a vernal pool again because the clay layer is gone. And who knows how long it's going to take to rebuild all this stuff. I don't think it'll ever come back to its natural state. We'll walk over here, but we're going to go up this way. If you can see that vernal pool over there, that's what this looked like. So we put the signs up, and immediately they accused the Oregon State Forest people of blocking entrance to the forest when all they're trying to do is protect an area. It's the only way you can stop them from doing what they're doing. You know, it's a 101 foot ridge. It's the whole face of this that they've destroyed. sticking with us? 3 miles to High Crossing, 3.2 miles, and there's a crossroad there. Okay. Oh, that's the one in this book. Okay. That's from this road right here. But they're going to start doing this, and they're using these other two now. So eventually this oak is going to go. And you know what? Somebody did come up here. Look, they bumped their fenders against the side. Wow, you gotta be an asshole to try that. But the last time I was here, this was the favorite one right here. That's a good 6 feet out of there. That they have a right to do this, and it's their woods too, and they don't look at it as an ecological system. They look at it as a place to run their trucks and their ATVs and motorcycles, and that's the way it is. They feel they have a cultural right to do it, and hardly anybody stops them, if at all. But they've ruined thousands of acres of land, and their cry is, well, it's 1.1 acres. What the heck? We're only going to use a little part of it. But this has been going on so many years that it's sort of, I think, just sort of everybody looks the other way, Now the sun will come up over here, and the moon, the crescent moon, will come up right over here. So as you get up, there's all these little ridges and valleys, and they'll all hold fog in the morning. And then, if the sky's pretty clear, you'll have the moon, and then when the sun comes up, if it comes up bright and there's some clouds around, it'll light up the clouds. So it could be a pretty interesting shot. Spent a whole day trying to find a location, and we got there, got all set up, and just waited for the sun to act right. And the whole valley just rung with coyotes screaming and yelling. It was really wild. There must have been 24 of them just yelping away in every direction. And it kind of made the whole thing, it was really cool. After 9 years, I was lucky enough to publish a book, and I think the book in itself, which is basically nothing more than a photographic monograph of my work, and I think it shows the beauty of the Pinelands and the reason why it should be preserved forever and always.
All right, thanks, Jacqueline, for sharing that. Got a couple minutes before we can start back up, but just to tell everyone a little bit about the film. So some of that footage was collected from 2012 up to 2017, and a few of those sites have actually been largely protected now, like Jemima Mount in Wharton State Forest. The superintendent Rob Auermuller was able to create a few barriers to prevent vehicles from going up over the top of the mount. Now in South Jersey, it's pretty flat, so Jemima Mount's only, I think, 120 feet above sea level, but it's significant for our area. The highest point in South Jersey is around 220 feet. And now there's a soon to be released map of a new hiking trail, which will also go over Jemima Mount. So it's kind of like a replacement use. So, it was, for a few years, it was taken over by off-road vehicles. The barriers were up, but there were still, people trying to go around the barriers. And now we'll have, a more official designated use, to keep an eye on the area and also allow the public to enjoy it. So our panel, I think Jacqueline is going to introduce everyone. So we can, I think, get started on that now.
Wonderful. So we have a great panel of local advocates here in the Pinelands. Of course, I know them all very well, worked together hand in hand with both Fred Akers and Emile DeVito for many, many years on off-road vehicle use. Oh goodness, I guess it's probably been over a decade or so that we worked on legislation that would increase fines for riding throughout the state of New Jersey. And obviously that was a step forward, but obviously there's much more that needs to be done. And it's something that never ends in terms of dealing with the illegal use of off-road vehicles. So first on the panel is Fred Akers, the administrator for the Great Egg Harbor Watershed Association. Fred has also been an advocate for Pinelands protections for many, many years, attending so many Pinelands Commission meetings. He also helps to run the River Council down in that area as well, and someone that we call a close friend. So Fred, I turn it over to you.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Connection holds up. So I manage a wild and scenic river in New Jersey that's in the Pinelands. And when I first started around 1999, 2000, one of the issues was ATV damage in the streams, in certain places and on public lands. So how am I doing? Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yes. Okay, I just, I'm trying to start the slideshow. So when I first started, I knew very little. I didn't know much at all. And I did a lot of research, and I ended up in Montana with my research. And I got connected to the Wildland Center for Preventing Roads, and also other places in California. And Wildland CPR was extremely helpful, and all the work that was being done out west in terms of generating science and defining the issues and providing, publications and all, that was just a huge help to me out here in New Jersey. And Bethany Walder was very helpful, and the Blue Water Network and the Natural Trails and Waters Coalition. They would do things like connecting me with the consumer safety issues, that whole safety aspect of off-road vehicle use. And Wildland CPR also connected me with some copies of the Thrillcraft book that I could I received and I handed out here in New Jersey to try to help educate and do outreach. And that was just absolutely awesome. The name Thrillcraft is really ingenious because it kind of portrays this selfishness on the part of the operators, owners, that they're getting a thrill. That's what they're doing. And the language in the book was really inspirational for me. And I have a lot of text slides, and I don't really like text slides, but I'm putting them up here just to portray the language. But there's one statement that I'm going to refer to later. It says, so George put in there, do we really want to waste our time debating where it's okay to trash public lands and where it isn't? And that's a debate that New Jersey had for 20 years. And I think we might be over it, but we had that debate for quite a while. So in 2002, New Jersey kind of started to become aware of the problem, and environmental groups started to organize and get together. And one of the keystone events that occurred was this off-road vehicle symposium was hosted by the New Jersey Trail Conference. So that was a big event, a big coming together of minds this is a problem. What are we going to do about it? The agenda was really good. It was very robust. People were serious. What came out of it was a brainstorming of a whole list of education and outreach ideas, how to inform the public of the issue, what was going on, what to do, maybe what not to do. And another part of it was really framing that there was a need for New Jersey to do legislation that would begin to get some control, some rules and regulations on the rampant use that was beginning to happen. So I had an unusual circumstance for what I was doing. In 2002, the governor nominated me to be on the Pinelands Commission. And I never made it on the commission, but I was called to the commissioner of the DEP's office for an interview. And Brad Campbell was the commissioner. He's a new commissioner in 2002. So here I am, Campbell's office, talking with Mr. Campbell about protecting the Pinelands. And I really started talking with him almost right away about the off-road vehicle issues and problems. And it turned out that in his federal job that he had become aware of the issue. So he was really well aware of it. And later that year, he came out with this huge policy, off-road vehicle policy for the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. And it was really a big deal because it framed the issue and the problems of off-road vehicles, motorized recreation on state lands. And his policy that came out in press releases and official releases was big, and it kind of went on, and the language in it was really cool, and it really defined what the problem was. He introduced some metrics to the issue, the hundreds of thousands of acres of state land that were damaged, the negative impacts. He kind of spelled them out, and that in some cases, maybe the damage was beyond repair. And there was also an issue at the time where state enforcement was, people are trying to stop these people and they were getting run over and injured. So it was a huge statement of the problem that came out in the public, and it was very useful going forward. However, as the way these things go, he also had to balance what he was proposing to do for rules and regulations with a proposal to establish legal places to ride. As the thing at the time was, it wasn't fair to stop people from riding. anywhere they wanted because they didn't have any place to go, as if that would ever have been a solution. But that's what the debate was back then. So he had a goal of establishing 2 facilities by 2005. But if you looked at the conditions that were required, it's like, no, they weren't going to ever really find any places that would work. But still, it was an important policy implementation that he did, and it was very helpful at the time for us to move with the legislation that we wanted. And he did something also that was pretty novel and new at the time. He came out with the concept of natural resource damages. So not only were you breaking the laws and you could maybe get a penalty for that, but if you damage the environment, you might have to pay to fix it. And establishing what the values were there was a whole set of metrics that were needed. And he indicated he was going to undertake that. I don't know if that ever happened, and then in the following year, he doubled down with another press release, another campaign. It had a zero tolerance policy. So all this was just extremely helpful to those of us that were trying to get the word out to the public that this was a problem. So here's the commissioner of the DEP doing it in spades. It was really great. Also, in 2003, the state did this big reporting project called the Comparative Risk Project. And I was pleased to see that they viewed the off-road vehicle damage as an official ecological risk to New Jersey. And in that review and publication, they brought out noise and air pollution, and then also the cost of other people not being able to enjoy the same places, and that it might cost the state money. So also in 2002, in the state capital, Trenton, New Jersey, an ATV struck and killed a woman. And the assemblyman who was from that district, a fellow named Reed Gussiora, posted a bill, sponsored a bill for off-road vehicle legislation. So it was pretty interesting. We found out that he had already done that when we started looking for a sponsor. He was already there. So we did outreach with him, encouraging him to expand his legislation to be more comprehensive, which is what eventually happened. And the Pinelands Preservation Alliance came out with a formal off-road vehicle campaign. I was pleased to be a principal participant in that. And they scheduled public meetings, and we went around the southern part of the state having public meetings to increase people's awareness and having riders come out and criticize us and give us a hard time. It was quite interesting, and our campaign had a lot of planks to it and a lot of things, thoughtful things that could be done. This is the three of us. This is your picture, Jacqueline, I put in there. So Emile and Jacqueline and I spent countless hours and days and weeks and months and years working on this issue, going to meetings, doing press releases, lobbying politicians, talking to the public, dealing with the riders, working very hard. And we all had other jobs, but we fit this in because it was a passion, and we knew that something needed to be done. So we were there doing it. And, you know, we were up against a strong opposition. So all of these logos and many more, including some deep pockets, were funding opposition to what we were trying to do. And let me also say that the three of us were not the only ones in the state of New Jersey. We were the leaders in the southern part of the state. but statewide, there were many other people that were kind of on our team, trying to get educating people on the issue, the problems, the values involved, and getting legislators to take some action to try to help control the damage and the problems. And because of those other interests that had big money, Reed Gussiora was really pressured. And what he decided he would do, and we weren't happy about this, is he sponsored another bill, which we called the Make a Park Bill. So he was going to balance the rules and regulation bills with a bill that would call for the designation of one site for ORV riders to be able to ride on. And even in his bill, if you look at the conditions to do that, you know, it just wasn't going to happen. And I think kind of he knew that, because there was an out clause. If the commissioner couldn't designate a site, he had to make a report as to why not. So also, as we were doing this, we realized that the legislation was maybe a long shot. Maybe it would happen, maybe it wouldn't. So Pinelands Preservation Alliance also launched an ordinance campaign at the municipal level. So the idea there is that we could do outreach to towns in our area in southern New Jersey and get the towns to establish ordinances that would regulate and control the use of off-road vehicles and limit the damage they were doing town by town. And this is just an example of one of our worksheets that we had, where we had our list of towns and we were going to them one by one, pitching the ordinance and trying to get them to implement something. So the legislation seemed like it was just taking forever. Here's maybe in 2008 it's going to happen, and nothing happened. And then in 2009, the Pinelands had a watch newsletter they did frequently. So maybe in 2009 the legislation was going to happen. But then finally, January 11, 2010, it happened. And it was kind of a wild and woolly sausage making thing, but there were 4 sponsors and there were 6 co-sponsors, which speaks to our efforts to recruit people to want to do this and want to lead and get it done. And if you look at the voting, it was not an easy lift to get this passed. So the Assembly was 57-17 and the Senate was 23-13. Those are pretty definitive numbers, but it was a tough lift. And what happened, unbeknownst to us in the sausage making, that the Make a Park bill was combined with the Rules and Regulations bill, and there was a requirement in the combined legislation that 3 sites were to be cited on state-owned land in state of New Jersey, 1 in the south, 1 in the middle of the state, and 1 in the northern part of the state. So that was like kind of a disappointment. And there was a 3-year time requirement to make that happen. So we're already like 9 years in, and now we got another 3 years. And it put us in this weird place where we were actually trying to find damage zones, sacrifice zones that would be acceptable. And we couldn't. We tried, but nobody on either side really wanted that. But the legislation got passed, and it was significant, and it was very detailed, and it did require registration, insurance, and tags. And there was some age restrictions, which were brought on by the safety issues and the death and injuries that the use calls for. So that was good to be in there. And it turned out that the 14-year age was the motorized community was really unhappy about that, because a lot of these people want their 6-year-old kids to be learning how to ride ATVs. But it basically put a fundamental set of rules and regulations in place, like where you could do this, where you can't, which is mostly where you couldn't. And it increased the fines, which we were hoping that they would be enough of a deterrent to be helpful. I don't think they have been, but that was the idea. And at least it gives lawmakers and the judiciary system some tools if they choose to use them, and some more tools than what they had. And the other part was the 3 ORV parks in 3 years. And again, the rules to do this with not damaging the environment and not affecting public safety, and you know, it just wasn't going to happen. So 10 years later, there are no ORV sites on state land in operation. During the process, we and George touched on this, the recreational trails program. I learned from the people out west that the mandatory minimum for motorized recreation was a real issue, and there was a fight to prevent that from being part of the recreational trails program that was lost. The motor companies that make these things won that battle for a 30% minimum for motorized recreation. And out here in New Jersey, the state was not able to spend that money. They had a hard time getting applicants and figuring out where to spend the 30% mandatory minimum. And that money was building up. So we decided that, well, maybe we could figure out some other way they could spend that money down than to make parks on state land. And in 2013, there was a whole motorized thing going on over in the town of Millville, just outside the Pinelands, where the town there approved a pretty big motorsports park for race cars and motorcycles. And there was an accessory piece to that, which was going to be an off-road vehicle park called the Field of Dreams. It was going to be approved. It was going to happen. So we went to the state and say, hey, why don't you use some of that mandatory minimum motorized recreation money to fund this thing? And it was a real thing, and it happened. And in 2013, the state, here's a release, they had 2.2 million in trail grants in 2013, and over 1 million of that went to the Field of Dreams Trail Park, which was funds from several prior grant cycles. So we were successful at that time in spending down that mandatory minimum funding money. And I don't want to take a lot of time, so that's the end of my presentation. And again, I want to thank the people from out west and the rest of the country for providing resources for us here in New Jersey to help us do what we could to change the culture here. And I think we achieved some success, but like Jacqueline said, the fight, it's a never-ending issue. And we'll just have to keep working at it.
Thanks, Fred. You tell such a great story. It sounds like we were superheroes. But it is true. It was a lot of work, but definitely worthwhile. So we're going to hold questions to the end. And next up, we have Emile DeVito. He is the Director for Conservation Science at New Jersey Conservation Foundation, another nonprofit organization in the state. Working on land preservation, although obviously focused a lot on policy issues. Emile serves on many different boards, including New Jersey Natural Lands Trust, Endangered and Non-Game Species Advisory Committee, and of course, the Pinelands Preservation Alliance, just to name a few. So Emile, I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Thanks, Fred, for that painful history. I can't believe all those years have passed, and I know we made a lot of progress, but then it seemed like the New Jersey DEP kind of started to pay much more attention to the stakeholders, being the riders and the recreational interests. Oh, maybe about 10 or 11 years ago. And so, obviously a lot of that progress has been stalled, and it's very frustrating. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if this works. Can everybody see the Earth? Is that working?
Yep.
Yep.
Great. So, okay. So a couple of comments. I mean, I think there's a huge problem with the idea that in New Jersey, if we have a few places to ride, that's somehow going to help the problem. Because very few of the participants in thrill seeking want to follow rules and want to go and pay money or have insurance or do the things that are required at legal parks. So, we had a park once. New Jersey Conservation Foundation worked with a nonprofit to try to set up a park in a gravel pit, and it was incredibly unsuccessful because folks who did not want to become members of that nonprofit and have insurance and follow rules would come and destroy everything that they created. They got money. They got motorized trail money, and in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and they made quite a nice facility, but it kept getting destroyed by the renegades who did not want to be told that there was a legal place to ride. So I don't think having a place to ride will ever solve anything. And I've been always trying to say that you should never get caught in the trap of saying, create a legal place and then the problem will get better, because it won't. It just plain won't. Let me take you on a little tour. So a lot of us have been talking about wetlands and little hilltops. I want to talk about something different. I want to talk about sand dunes in the Pine Barrens. Here's a sand dune that was at the end of a dead-end sand road. I'll just zoom out a tiny bit, right? And you can see that this sand dune is surrounded by a swamp. These are called paleo dunes. They're dunes that were created at the during the Ice Age, and they're often associated with a vernal pond on one side, and then a small swale, which is a pile of windblown sand. And these are incredibly critical habitats. So someone mentioned earlier, the Pine Barrens is many hundreds of thousands of acres, and we only need a few areas where we want to ride. But the problem is, the places that the thrillcraft folks want to ride, they want to destroy these wetlands, like you saw in Al Horner's movie and in other pictures already shown by other speakers, destroying the wetlands, or they want to ride on sand dunes and tear them up because it's easy. They don't have a lot of vegetation on them. And those are the two places that have most of all the rare and endangered species of either wetland or upland species of plants and animals. They're some of the most critical habitats. So the impact of riding in a few areas is much greater than it would seem, because the folks riding these vehicles are not just riding on a random set of habitats. They're riding in the most critical habitats. So I just want to show you some of the things we've managed to do since the government really has been ineffective in doing anything on our public lands. What we've been trying to do is, let me see, I just got to get to the right. Okay, I'll zoom back in. So here's this sand dune, And it's at the end, it's at a dead end of an old sand road, which was probably a Jeep road, possibly to a logging site at one point in the swamp, and then became a Jeep road for a hunter to go and park his truck and go deer hunting. Well, it just so happens that on this sand dune, there's a population of one of the rarest plants in the Pine Barrens called Pickering's Morning Glory. Doesn't look like much. It's a tiny little white flower, blooms in the summer, and it's long-lived, and it has very low reproductive rates. And it was getting run over by the few pickup trucks that would go back here. And so we put up signs and asked the deer hunters to park over here. We even made a parking spot, and they just shot up our signs with their shotgun shells. They didn't want to park here. They wanted to park 20 yards further to the west. So eventually we decided, well, we just drag a bunch of trees in, and we created sort of the Great Wall of the Pine Barrens here with a bunch of trees that we dragged in so that no one could get past that spot. And that was very effective, and it's lasted now. There hasn't been a car in there for 12 years. And so now, if you look at it, the sand road is disappearing. The rare plant population is expanding. And 5 years in, threatened pine snakes started to nest here again. And there have been about 4 or 5 pine snake nests in this sand dune in the last 4 or 5 years. Some years they skip. But so we have these 2 rare species now utilizing this site and not getting run over. So that's a positive. On a tiny scale, it's a positive. Just want to show you a few more places pretty quickly. Trying not to name these places because it's not a good idea to just tell everybody where everything is. I trust all of you that are on the call, but you never know who else might be on the call. So here's a place, another example of a wetland with paleo dunes on either side. This is a fabulous paleo dune that's hardly ever been disturbed. There's an old cranberry farm in here that's long since been abandoned. And then here's a through road, a through sand road that goes along a long paleo dune, and it's pretty much been destroyed. All the habitat along, oh, rats, I didn't mean to do that yet. But I want to, actually, I did mean to do that. There's someone on the call, I hope they're still here, from Southern Utah Wilderness Protection Nonprofit. Are you still here? Hopefully. So here's a place. This is Kanab, Utah, right here near the Arizona border. And this is a magnificent place called Coral Pink Sand Dunes State Park that I was at about a month ago. And the sand dunes are about 3,000 acres, and they're home to an endemic tiger beetle, which has been proposed for federal listing, one of the rarest insects in the world. And this little tiny red area is about 25 acres. You can see there's a little visitor center here and a parking lot and an observation platform. And this is the area that's closed off to off-road vehicles out of the entire state park. And this is the area where these tiger beetles have, habitat that isn't being destroyed every weekend. And when I say destroyed, I mean destroyed. Okay, we're just going to go outside the fence and we're going to zoom in a little bit. It's hard to see because the landscape is so whitish pink, but you can see that this entire state park is nothing but monster truck tracks and ORV tracks and circles and shapes of all kind. And this is a state park, and it's basically an unregulated off-road vehicle recreation area. And it's a rare geologic formation, and there are rare species, and it's being utterly destroyed. So the thing that bothers me is that if some states, and not that New Jersey's much better, but if some states are saying, we're going to give over an entire state park of thousands of acres to off-road vehicle riders, then how in heaven's name can New Jersey take a stance and say we need to protect these little sand dunes that are 10 or 15 acres in size or even less? It's just really frustrating because, as we saw in the movies and the other presentations today, the most of this country has, very limited ability to do anything about this problem, nor do they even have the chutzpah to try to do something about it because of the incredible, powerful lobby. I'm pleased to hear that the White Mountains have banned off-road vehicles. You know, some areas that are so mountainous and rocky, maybe it's a little bit easier to do that. But these places that are composed of sand, that are just targets for this type of recreation, it's just going to be much harder to do. Here's a place that Jason Howell, I would give the credit to for this one. This, again, was a rare snake and rare plant site. This used to be the largest population of Pickering's morning glory known in the entire Pine Barrens in the 1980s, and it was down to one plant a few years ago. Recently, we've managed to do some protective efforts. Just take a look at this. I think let me just check. I'm just for a moment, I got a little bit confused. I'm sorry. So this is a place that we have not been able to protect yet, right? This is that same sand dune that we were at a little while ago, the one pristine sand dune on one side of the stream, and then this ridge that's just being, that, you know, havoc is being wreaked upon it. And with these gigantic circles, if you zoom in, you know, this circle is only, let's just take a look at this. Right here is, I'm gonna just do a measurement from here to there is 40 feet. So, you know, this is a person driving around in a tight circle time after time after time. And these circles get to be 4, 6, 8 feet deep, so that when the vehicles drive around in them, they turn up on an angle, you know, like on a bank. And they just keep going around in circles for hours on end, I guess, until they run out of gas or until their brains fall out of one side of their head. But so I've coined a phrase for these things. You can see them all over the Pine Barrens. I call them idiot circles. And they're just popping up everywhere. You can just see them everywhere on satellite photographs. And they're incredibly frustrating because it's all rare habitat that's being destroyed and turned into an absolute wasteland. We'll just zip over to some other places. So here's a place that, that hasn't happened yet. Yes, Jacqueline.
I was going to say maybe like another minute.
Yeah, sure. Here's a place where that hasn't happened yet. There's this pristine sand dune that they haven't reached, but they have come into this one, this other piece of it. And if you zoom in, you can actually see, we did a big survey last summer of pine snake nests. And it turned out that there's actually a pine snake nest right here. This little white spot that's right under the cursor is a pine snake nest. And last summer, this pine snake nesting area got run over. The superintendent of the state forest has done a great job in trying to block this off since then over here. And hopefully the problem will subside. So we're trying to do that on many of these sand dunes. Let me just take you to a couple in the last minute, take you to one that I just want to point out that Jason Howell has done a great job. And also the superintendent of the state forest has done a great job. This is a long sand dune and it has all sorts of rare habitat in it. You can see another idiot circle right there from outer space. And a gate has been installed right here, up here by the main road. So hopefully that one can start to heal. And then finally, I just want to show you one really quickly. Okay, here, this is the last thing I want to show you. This is a sand dune that had the largest population of that rare plant, Pickering's morning glory. And now watch carefully. This is before we did a little bit of management activity. And then we did some management activity in the central part of this dune. And we blocked off some of the access roads. And we kind of delineated where a hunter could drive his truck to go deer hunting, trying to keep him off of the critical habitat. And you can see that the vegetation is starting to come back. and the deer hunters are more constrained to following, the road that you leave them. But the off-road vehicles are not getting out there anymore and tearing the place up. Now that could change at any minute. All these things are so precarious, but we need to be surveying the entire Pine Barrens for every piece of critical habitat and figuring out and prioritizing which ones to protect, whether they're sand dunes or wetlands or little hilltops, whatever unique geologic features, riverbanks. And we need to have drastic action taken quickly because so many of these places are being beaten upon and at an incredible rate. So I hope that has given you a picture of some of the things that we need to do.
Thanks, Emile. And I think it's great just seeing the type of technology that we have available to be able to look at some of these areas without necessarily being on foot, because sometimes it's hard to really see the extent of the problem unless you're up high. All right.
Absolutely true. Yes.
Last but not least, our public lands advocate, and who is an impressive videographer. He has so many skills, both in terms of managing sites, public lands, as well as private lands, as well as his filming skills. So Jason, you're up.
Hi, everybody. I think everybody, Fred and Emile covered things really well for the Pinelands. I just want to brief on just one issue, which is dealing with the information space and the communications landscape. I think, this quote's very old, but I think it's still really relevant today. And Abraham Lincoln said that in this country, public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail, and against it, nothing can succeed. And whoever molds public sentiment goes deeper than they who enact statutes or pronounces judicial decisions. And I think that's really relevant to our issue here, because how people understand the landscape and understand the places in which we operate is really fundamental on how they're treated thereafter. So changing the culture for the better, and communicating properly and in a way that doesn't immediately create defensiveness, I think is really important. And I'm still learning. We as an organization, we're still learning how to do this. And I think this post that I'm sharing now from the New Jersey Parks and Forestry Department, I think is very illustrative of that point. Where if you come out with just saying this is banned, right? Humans really have this strange response to just someone saying no. It's not always that useful. But if you can come in, and I'll try to help out every once in a while when I see things like this online. If you can come in and say, okay, what can you do in these places? It's really not enough to say what you can't do. We have to give people options. So, okay, ATVs are banned. Got it. But what else are we communicating here? We got to say what we can do. You can kayak, you can canoe, bicycle. You can drive a legal motor vehicle slowly, peacefully, and observe wildlife. Listen to peace and quiet. You can run, hike, use a motorized conveyance if you have a disability. You can hunt, trap, row boats, look for insects. You get the idea. There's so much that people can do. I think we have to put the focus on, what are the appropriate activities, and are we promoting, or are we providing enough avenues for recreation, especially in New Jersey, where the New Jersey Pinelands, people think of it as a really big space, and for the East Coast it is, and maybe not so much for the West Coast, but 1.1 million acres of somewhat preserved landscape with maybe 550, 600,000 acres of actual public lands. That's a lot for New Jersey, but it's not enough to accommodate 20 million people that surround New Jersey if the use is going to be off-road vehicles. But we can designate areas, so we've been working with the State Park Service, with New Jersey Fish and Wildlife, to try and get some more designations so people can get into the backcountry, can go explore these places and do it in ways that are, we view more sustainably, like hiking, biking, canoeing, etc. And the other thing we really need to do is communicate why this issue is important, and how we do that is really really critical. Can everybody see this screen share I have up of the before and after? So this is a pond in Wharton State Forest. In 2015, it had 0 protections, and it was a monster truck ATV destination. Emile and I went out there and observed the pond. Eventually, the superintendent, the Park Service, was able to put up a barrier. And by 2020, vegetation was starting to regrow. Things were looking good. And, there's some slight seasonal differences here too, but this really captures for the public why this issue is important. Do we want our public lands to be driven over, mudscapes, or do we want beautiful natural lands where people can enjoy peace and quiet, solitude, and the beauty of nature? And simple messages like this, simple stories, telling the story why it's important to us, what the people can do to protect it, how they can help, and what our government needs to do to make sure our public lands are protected and beautiful. I think this is critical. And building the communications platforms that we need, I think is also really important. So, we've been building our various platforms like Facebook groups, Instagram groups, so we can operate in the communication space, because it's not like we're the only ones out there. We also have, organizations that are working against our messages. So we have to be better. We have to be able to reach further and communicate more effectively. And I think that's the major thing I wanted to talk about. So I think we can open it up for questions now for all the panel.
I have a question. The same one I put earlier, I'd like to put to everybody on the panel. And, Jason obviously is making a really important point here that we have to have PR campaigns to draw public attention to the beauty of the Pinelands and the recreational values. But since there's always going to be that outlaw element, and we see it very plainly over and over again, we've been seeing it for decades, we also need law enforcement officials to do their job. And if they're complicit and sympathetic to the point where they won't write tickets when they have the opportunity to do it, then we're missing a big piece of the strategy right there. And if we have folks in the DEP who won't do their job, that's another big piece that's missing. So it seems to me it's got to be both. It's got to be the PR stuff, but it also has to be, the enforcement element too, and policy stuff. And that's where I think we haven't been able to make a lot of progress, in spite of the fact that folks like Emile and Jason and others have, really done a great job of succeeding in specific locations. And Rob Auermuller, putting up the barriers. So yeah, we have these localized success stories, but I don't know if we're going to be able to generalize that if we don't get this other piece in there, the law enforcement and the policy piece.
So I agree, absolutely, because we just won't be able to keep up. I mean, even if we had some incredibly high compliance rate among the general public of realizing that, okay, if you want to drive a motorized vehicle, you need to do it on a sand path that you're allowed to do it on. And you're not allowed to go in wetlands. You're not allowed to go on sand dunes. You're not allowed to cause erosion on stream banks. And even if we had, let's say we had some incredibly high number, like, 90 to 95% compliance with that. With these vehicles, the damage that a couple of people can do in a few minutes, it just lasts for decades. And so we can't keep ahead of that unless we have enforcement at a level that seriously deters people from breaking the rules. The idea, we were told in the field by, government officials many times, oh, can't you just put up a sign and say, rare plants grow here, or rare butterflies, lay their eggs here? It's just appalling that, a government official who knows nothing about biology would say, oh, please put up a sign, and expect people who are drunk at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday night and all they want to do is throw up mud to pay attention to something like that. It's just appalling that a government official thinks that all we need to do is educate people, and that law enforcement has to be the key plank of the solution I wish I knew how to make that happen.
I regularly attend the Pinelands Commission meetings, and I've seen the Pinelands Commission putting pressure on DEP. And DEPs, I've seen it twice now, at least twice, where they have been keeping some metrics of what their enforcement level of activity has been, how many violations, how many complaints. So that's a little bit of improvement. I'm not sure if that's going to be sustained or increased, but I think that the managers at the assistant commission level understand that that's like a problem, and that they're being pressed on it. I was also on a call, and I think you, Emile, you were on that call with somebody from the judicial department of the state, and we pitched at that point. This is in the spring. We pitched at that point that in the fines and penalties need to be higher, and I think, you know, I've advocated for that for years, and I think that will maybe help enforcement. So if a police officer or park police apprehend somebody and they go to court and they just get a slap on the wrist, the enforcement might say, well, what's the point? They'll just be back doing it again. But if there's a more severe penalty put on it by the judiciary, more satisfying to them. But it's a problem, and I don't have the answers, but I think it's on the radar.
Yeah,
I
definitely a good
just want to
point.
make a quick comment. A number of us who were on this call were on a tour with New Jersey's current Attorney General a couple years ago, before COVID happened, before COVID-19. And we only had a few minutes of his time, but we were able to take him to a couple of places that had been impacted. And they weren't even the places, you know, we couldn't get him way deep into the forest where you have some of these nightmarish issues. We were just able to give him a sampling of some of the minor impacts by off-road vehicles. And he was absolutely appalled. He had no idea that this was happening on state, you know, public lands, state forest lands, state park lands. And I think that if COVID hadn't happened, you know, we might have been able to get some more action in that regard. Now that we're coming out of COVID, I think we have to redouble our efforts to contact the Attorney General's office, and hopefully he'll be the Attorney General past January, you know, because we have an election coming up. Unfortunately, a lot of his term has been usurped by all the problems with COVID. But, you know, I'm a little bit optimistic that we have some people in place that, you know, if they didn't have to spend all their time on these, you know, human resource issues of, you know, sickness and poverty and, you know, drugs and all that, if some of that would ease up a little bit, then maybe we could get some action on natural resource issues. I think we have people who would care. It's just that, you know, their time is as precious as anyone's, and they have some huge problems to deal with. So, you know, hopefully we can get some favorable outcomes there in the next year or so.
Yep, totally agree. I just wanted to say that, you know, we are hearing some positive noise from different departments and agencies, including DEP, and that, you know, hopefully that will turn into something over the next several months. And there was a paper about article about that not that long ago. I wanted to say that we are at a little over 2:30, so want to give our next speakers an opportunity. We are going to have more group discussion after our next two speakers, which are going to share some additional great information, both about Pinelands specific studies as well as lawsuit from another state. So I think they should be very interesting. Jason, do you want to introduce our next speaker? And thank you all for your contribution on the panel today.
And so our next guest is Marilyn Sobel. She is a staff scientist for the Pinelands Commission, a research scientist. And Marilyn obtained her PhD in environmental science from Drexel University, and she has expertise in rare plants, fire ecology, and wildlife surveying. And she's going to be presenting the Pinelands Commission's recent survey and analysis of Pinelands intermittent ponds that have been impacted by off-road vehicles. So Marilyn, please feel free to unmute yourself and share your screen now.
Okay, I'm assuming everybody can see my slide here.
We can.
Great, and you can hear me just fine?
Yep.
Awesome. So as Jason said, I'm going to be talking about the Pinelands survey of off-road vehicle damage. This survey was instituted by the Pinelands Commission Science Office. And so you can see the main members here, but I will also be talking about the great help that we got from the Pinelands Preservation Alliance, as well as from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. So it was a real group effort. I do want to talk a little bit about why the Pinelands is a destination of choice. So first of all, it is the largest open area on the East Coast between Boston, Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. So look at all the major cities here that are within a fairly easy driving distance of the Pinelands. And then if you look at this map, these are not improved regular roads. These are all unimproved roads in the Pinelands. So sand roads, gravel roads, and you can see there are a lot of them and they're very extensive. So it's incredibly easy to get access. And then finally, the topography is quite flat. So the problems in the West, I'm from California and I'm well aware of the many, many problems in the West. They're mostly due to people seeking out challenging terrain with really strong elevational gradients. And that in itself can cause a lot of damage, enormous damage. Here we have a different problem. The elevational changes are really small, which makes it extremely easy to get into wetlands and other sensitive places. So I was doing some research, and one of the things that I think is interesting, I believe George and a few other people talked about this sensitivity to the ORV drivers as stakeholders. So although there's very little research in the East on damage, there's a great deal of research on what ORV drivers want and the like. And one of the things that I actually found surprising was the importance of the social aspect of ORV driving. So the thing about the Pinelands is it's incredibly easy to get large groups that you can do a bunch of things together with, since there are a lot of urban areas nearby. There are many social media posts that encourage people to come to the Pinelands. I do want to mention that compared to what at least I saw 5 or 6 years ago, the posts do mention much more often enforcement, the need to stay on roads and the like. So there is some positive communication out there. Very few studies have actually been done on ORV activity in kind of forested environments. It is mostly in areas out west, but very sandy areas, usually deserts and the like. However, in general, studies indicate that people are looking to test their skills. As George mentioned, this is not an activity for the poor, okay? People spend a lot of money on enhancements to their vehicles so that they can do crazy things. And then, of course, they want to go out and do them. So the Pine Barrens does offer fairly easily accessible muddy ponds, gravel pits, and the like, that people can utilize their skills. And the reason I want to emphasize this is because this is not going to go away. And, I think we need to identify what the issues are before we can really try to solve these problems. So Pinelands ponds are unique in some ways, just because the Pinelands area itself is a very specialized environment, particularly because of the acidic water and soil and fire frequency. And so off-road vehicles can disturb these ponds even above and beyond the physical damage that they do because, you know, there's going to be motor oil and other kinds of chemicals that can alter the chemistry of the ponds. And that in and of itself is going to leave pinelands organisms vulnerable to invasion. So we did a study for the U.S. Department of Environmental Protection on pinelands wetlands, and we found many different key organisms in these ponds. And among the species that we found were several that were protected. One reason that ponds are important features of the landscape is because they tie together both aquatic and terrestrial species. Frogs, toads, dragonflies, and damselflies all develop in ponds before moving on to their terrestrial lives as adults. So you have nutrients that are being moved from aquatic environments to the terrestrial environment, and you have these aquatic communities that then become terrestrial communities. And so you do have very important and unique ecological communities that are at risk from ORV damage. So even though 0.3% may not seem like a lot, these are very important wetlands in terms of providing habitat for both rare and common organisms. And this is going to be the only place that they're going to be able to live. And they are also going to need new environments to disperse to. So off-road vehicles obviously do a lot of damage. We have seen that before. And one thing I want to mention, because we were talking about the PR element, is when we did this presentation to the Pinelands Commission, I was in the audience and I was watching people's reactions and the expressions on their faces, the look of incredible shock. So we're out there all the time and we have a lot of value for these environments, natural environments, but many people, you know, spend their whole lives and they spend very little time in the forest. They don't know what's going on. The Pinelands is a protected area. They probably don't think that these kinds of things are happening in these ponds. And so I think that this is a very valuable tool for us to actually show the kind of damage that's out there. After all, what kind of pictures do people post on Instagram? Beautiful pictures of cute organisms and sunsets and the like. People don't post these types of pictures. And so people do not know that this kind of damage is going on out in the Pine Barrens. And I feel like if people do know that, they are much more responsive. Now here we have a pond that's on private land. So study after study, even though it's mostly been done in the West, has shown that soil compaction is a huge problem anywhere that you have ORV vehicles. And you can see here that the ORV vehicles have completely denuded this pond of any vegetation. That's because when the soil is compacted, plant roots just aren't strong enough to push through that heavy compacted soil. And that is one of the ways that it does damage. And then that in and of itself tends to lead to higher degrees of erosion because vegetation actually helps to hold in the soil. And I think this is something that perhaps people don't realize. In the film that was shown earlier, and they were talking to an ORV user, and he said, well, the dirt's just going to erode anyway, in floods and things. Well, that's not true. If there's vegetation there, it's not going to erode. But if you get rid of the vegetation, yes, it will. And so these sorts of things are, I'm sure, the things that ordinary people think, not just lawbreakers, right? And so this is the kind of message that we need to get out. This is perfectly preventable damage. Erosion, of course, leads to increased sedimentation. And so we can see that this pond is all cloudy, just like the stream that we saw earlier. When there's no light penetration, there's also no plant growth. So, you get into this really vicious circle where it's impossible for the plants to grow. And then obviously, if there are no plants, then the organisms that depend on those plants also don't exist. So this creates a really big problem. Another problem that's created by this kind of sedimentation and lack of light penetration is that you don't get a lot of plants that are going to grow on the bottom of the pond. And those plants actually do a lot to oxygenate the water, especially in the pinelands, because most of the ponds are shallow. So a lack of oxygen in the water is going to be another thing that is going to make it impossible for organisms to live. So no respect for private property, just, go ahead and drive where you want to drive. That's something that we see.
in the Pinelands. So these are examples of completely intact ponds, and you can see a huge difference. You can see the extraordinary clarity of the water. You can see how much vegetation is growing in these ponds, and this shows how important it is to have protective measures. George mentioned this flexible signposts and how they don't really do any good. I mean, this is true. Sometimes I need to actually drive over them to get to places where I need to work. But at least if it's there, and somebody's on the road, they can't say they didn't know they weren't supposed to be on that road. So they provide some measure of protection. The metal roadside signs seem to have done some good. That's my understanding, that we're seeing less activity in areas where they have increased patrols. And again, people can't say they don't know. Now, one of the studies that I looked at said it was a study in New York State that ORV drivers do want to know where they're allowed to go and not allowed to go. As Emile DeVito was saying, the rogue element doesn't have to be large. There can be lots of people that are following the law. Of course, one of the concerns is even people that are legally on roads can be doing a lot of damage. So the most effective thing, especially when you have this rogue element, is just to stop people from being able to go into the ponds, no matter how desperately they wanted to get in there. And this rogue element is very important. There are people who just like to break the law, because as Jason was saying, if you say no to people, sometimes they just want to do it. I looked at a couple of social media posts, and there is a group out there, of ATV drivers that seem to take a particular pride in not following social norms. And so you do get these people, and they really are the ones I think that we have to kind of focus on, because they really are the ones that wreak havoc in the Pine Barrens. So we received a grant from the Environmental Protection Agency to study ponds in the Pinelands. And as part of that grant, we're going to map the ponds in the Pinelands, which gave us a unique opportunity to conduct these surveys, because mapping something like ponds in the Pinelands, most of them are fairly small, is a very large undertaking. So it took months of aerial surveys to identify where these ponds were and map out their aerial extent. And so then we could use that information to conduct the surveys. So we mapped about 4,400 ponds, 2,700 natural, 1,700 excavated, and we were able to visit, with the help of the NJDEP and Pinelands Preservation Alliance, 847 of those in person. So we could actually be on the ground and see if there was any damage. Unfortunately, of course, time constraints and other constraints would not have allowed us to survey every single pond. For one thing, some of them were down roads that were impossible to pass. So others might have been on or adjacent to military installations or shooting ranges. So there were some constraints. Fortunately, through aerial surveys, you can actually often see ORV damage, just as you can with the sand dunes. And so I have to give a shout out to Patrick Burrett, because he was the one who zoomed in and looked at all of those 3,500 ponds, so he could actually determine whether there was ORV damage. So that also is a very time consuming thing. So checking for damage actually, does take a lot of time. It does take some professional expertise, and so that's another consideration. So what we found was 195 of these 4,400 ponds were damaged by ORVs. 84 natural ponds, 111 excavated ponds. 46 of these ponds had extensive damage. So extensive damage can be defined as the kind of damage that you saw in the photos, right? And, deep ruts, sedimentation, loss of vegetation. Minimal damage would have been more like you could see roads going into the pond, but there was still lots of vegetation around, or perhaps it was damaged in the past, but there was no recent evidence of damage, and no evidence of sedimentation, those kinds of things. We also looked for other forms of damage. So I think George was mentioning that he'd heard the mafia maybe like dumped hazardous waste or something, but you know, people do dump a lot of things out in the Pine Barrens, right? You know, so trash, throwing out your trash is a big thing that you do, and you know, so we looked at all of those types of damage as well. We recommended 49 ponds for immediate protection. 32 have already been damaged. Of those 195 damaged ponds, the majority were on non-state land. So here the red dots represent the damaged ponds. The dark green is the state land. All right, and so the light green is non-state land. And so you can see, of course, there's more non-state land. So it's not terribly surprising that there were more damaged ponds on non-state land. But nevertheless, 40% of the ponds, damaged ponds, were on state land. And that actually represents a higher percentage of the damaged ponds. Natural ponds were not nearly as likely to be damaged as excavated ponds. That was true for both non-state and state land. On state land, you can see there's a huge difference between natural ponds and excavated ponds. Presumably, this is because excavated ponds are usually larger and deeper, but they may also just be more accessible, since you're usually going to find them near farmland or other places, like not very far out into the wilderness. If we break it down by agency, the Natural Lands Trust clearly had the highest percentage of damaged ponds. Now, that may not be due to any particular management decisions, but just the fact that Natural Lands Trust tends to buy up land that's already been damaged, so gravel pits and things like that. So probably a great many of these ponds had already been used extensively before Natural Lands Trust even started managing them. Nevertheless, you can see that both Fish and Wildlife and Parks and Forestry have a large number of damaged ponds on their lands, in spite of the fact that these places are generally going to be protected. We were interested in predicting whether or not a pond was vulnerable to ORV damage. We wanted to know if there was a way that we could figure out how to direct resources to ponds and try to prevent ORV damage perhaps before it even happens. We started with 10 variables, and they had to be variables where we could measure them at all the ponds. So one thing that perhaps influences ORV drivers is the depth of the pond, but we couldn't go out and measure the depth of 4,000 ponds. Nevertheless, we have a number of key variables like pond size, for example, which is often related to pond depth. We also looked at the surface of the pond. What was the percentage of open water, herbaceous vegetation, shrub, and tree cover that was visible? And we did this through aerial photography. And then we looked at the percentage of surrounding land that was developed or used for agriculture. We also looked at the nearest road, either sand or paved, and the distance to the nearest commission-approved enduro route, and the distance to the nearest pond that we already knew was damaged. We developed a statistical model. This was my job, and we used logistic regression for it. So logistic regression determines a probability, and it's often used in these kind of binary situations. So the pond is either damaged or undamaged. What are the variables that influence that outcome? And we used that to determine the probability that a pond would be damaged. So we had 195 ponds we knew were damaged. We looked at those factors with those ponds, and then we randomly selected 195 ponds that were undamaged, as far as we know, and we looked at their factors, their size, for example. And so we were able to develop models. And when we developed the models, we found that only 5 variables were important out of the 10 that we looked at. So pond size was the most influential variable, followed by the percentage of water, the percentage of herbaceous vegetation, and the distance to the nearest road, either sand or paved, and the distance to the nearest damaged pond. So here's an example of a pond that kind of meets those criteria. So this is a pond that we would consider high risk. This is 2007 aerial photography. This is a pond nearby that has already been damaged. So it's a pond that's close to a damaged pond. It's close to a road. It's large. It has extensive herbaceous vegetation and open water zones. So perhaps unsurprisingly, by 2012, this pond had been damaged, and you can see the ORV track damage. Then we established barriers in 2017. And so 2 years after these barriers were established, you can see huge differences in both ponds. Just like Jason was showing in his photograph, you can see the vegetation is coming back. It now looks like a natural pond instead of like a muddy mess. So here are the barriers, and these are extremely effective. Unfortunately, as far as I know, they've only been established 4 ponds. Jason, you might have some more updated information on that. But for some reason, they're just not being put out there. It is kind of time consuming to install them. And of course, you have to spend money because they are very substantial barriers, but still feels like 4 is not very much. From the information that we developed about what makes ponds vulnerable, we then applied this information to all 4,432 ponds so that we could develop a map about risk. And you will not be surprised to know that the red dots represent ponds at highest risk. So we found 391 ponds that we would say were high-risk ponds, a greater than 75% probability that these ponds would be damaged by ORV activity. The majority of the ponds were at medium risk, and then about 1,500 were at low risk, meaning less than 25% probability. Now, this was a model to determine vulnerability. So we actually assessed the ponds that we already knew were damaged. And some of those ponds did not look like they were high-risk ponds. The majority did. I was really kind of interested in whether or not, the risk map would actually predict correctly that ponds were at high risk, and the majority did. But there were a few situations where the pond was assessed as a low-risk pond, even though it had already been damaged. And that is probably due to the fact that we weren't able to include all of the true risk factors, like depth, for example, in our model. Now, risk can be categorized in ways other than this map, but this is a nice, easy visual to give people a sense of where they might want to direct their resources. And if you look closely at the map, you can see that a lot of the high-risk ponds are kind of on the outer edges of forests. So they're close to more urbanized areas, villages, towns, and the like. And so that might be useful information as we start to think about how we want to direct policy. So our next steps at the Pinelands Commission are to continue to document ORV damage at sites that we monitor on a regular basis, and to continue to report ORV damage to the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Our study was funded mainly by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, but also by the Pinelands Commission. We had the help of Joel Mott and summer intern Erica Schoenberg in surveying these ponds. And at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, we had Mike Bisignano, Jason Halfstead, Robert Moyer, Terry Schmidt, Jessica Ray, and Kathleen Waltz. The Pinelands Preservation Alliance, we had the wonderful help of Jim Hansen, Kate Harrelson, Michael Hogan, Jason Howell, Duncan Jay, Sarah Lastuski, Adam Penn, Raven Petoskey, Ryan Rebozo, and Wayne Russell. I hope I didn't mangle anyone's name. Any questions?
That was really great, Marilyn. Thank you. And feel free to turn off your screen share now. And
Okay.
maybe we could just take a couple questions, and then at the end we could discuss. I see Paula. Paula, you have your hand up. Do you want to go first? Just going to ask you to unmute, Paula.
Sorry. We've seen so much documentation today, but going back decades and this commission study, and it seems like we have the documentation. We know it's happening. What is I don't mean to put you on the spot, but is the Pinelands Commission going to do anything with their pond study?
Well, okay. So I am not usually the person who interacts with other groups, right? The leaders of other groups, politicians, and the like. As I said, I did the statistical aspect of the study, so I usually have a more behind the scenes role. So it is unfortunately hard for me to answer that. I have some personal ideas that I would like to share at the end when we all talk about that. They're not policies of the Pinelands Commission. As I think Fred Akers mentioned, the Pinelands Commission has tried to put some pressure, on the New Jersey DEP, but we've all seen it takes a lot. It takes years. It takes a lot of policy formulations. It takes a lot of, pressure, and the Pinelands Commission has like a lot of activities going on, not just ORV protection. So I guess basically I'm not aware of a particular direction in terms of ORV protection, but hopefully there will be one.
And Paul, I just want to reference that we are using the Pinelands Commission study to ask and demand that the DEP does follow through, especially on the the analysis of high risk ponds and those needing immediate protection. Although, we haven't been very successful at that so far, and that's something we really need to try to refocus on now.
I'd like to add to that. This is Emile DeVito. Jason, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but you put the list together of 10 important sites. I think most of them were wetlands, probably a couple of years ago now. And despite, I know that COVID's been a problem, but I think the DEP has only given us permission to even close off 6 of those areas out of the 10, I believe.
Well, we have the go ahead to do 2, coordinate with the State Park Service and do two of those sites, both ponds, one in Bass River and one in Brennan T. Burn this summer, and then hopefully more going forward. But, as you can see from the presentation, we're talking about hundreds of sites. So,
right. I mean, clearly volunteers are needed, right? Because if first of all, the state doesn't even have the staff to do the work, at more than, maybe one pond every couple of weeks, if there were dedicated people that were even able to do it, and it would cost too much. But even if we had a cadre of volunteers and, the cost of barriers has skyrocketed during COVID, the cost of wood has gone way up. I mean, it's incredibly expensive. I think we'd probably need a few $1 million to make a dent. In a couple of years, maybe we could protect, 50 ponds or something like that. If we had volunteers and money and the ability to do the work on state land and the proper permissions, but all of those things are obstacles. So, and of course, now we're not even talking about the issue of, the legal aspect of trying to slow the destruction. It would be helpful, I think, Jason, if you could describe the time. I wasn't there, but you were there when someone came to the commission and portrayed themselves as a protector of the environment, and then on Facebook they were recruiting people to go destroy ponds. I think that would be pretty helpful if you could just describe that.
Yeah, that's part of the communications game, where some groups will portray themselves as being more kind of greenwashing the activity of ORV use, but that's up to us to tell the right stories to, really, describe the situation well with the public. But hey, Marilyn, I just want to thank you so much. I hope you can stay to the end because I'm sure there'll be more questions, but, I just want to.
Yes, I definitely plan to. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak.
Great. Thank you very much. And, our next guest is Marla Fox. and she is an attorney with the nonprofit advocacy group Wild Earth Guardians, and her work focuses on developing strategic legal advocacy to reclaim places for the wild and reconnect wildlife habitat and waterways across the American West. Originally from Minnesota, Marla spent her early years swimming and fishing in lakes and waterways, and Marla will be presenting her work on litigation to protect the Bitterroot National Forest and wolverines, as well as sage grouse habitat in California. So let me make sure Marla is unmuted and has the ability to share her screen. A co-host. Okay. All right. Hi, Marla.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us today.
For sure. Hi. Yeah, thank you, Jason, for inviting me and the introduction. I'm Marla Fox. I'm a staff attorney at Wild Earth Guardians. And Wild Earth Guardians' mission is to protect and defend the wild places, wild rivers, wildlife, and health of the American West. So the case examples I'm going to talk about are all from the West, not from New Jersey. And I do focus on federal public lands, but I've been listening and taking notes, so I'm going to try to tie in some New Jersey aspects as we go through this. I'm speaking to you all from my home in Carson, Washington in the Columbia River Gorge. And the photo you see is from Stevenson, Washington, looking at the gorge. So because I am talking about public land management and federal law, it's important to acknowledge that the land I sit on was stolen from the Confederated Tribes and bands of the Yakama Nation and the Cowlitz Indian tribe through genocide and forced removal. And I identify these tribes not simply as a mark of history, but also to note that the tribes continue despite oppression and deserve celebrating. So this land acknowledgement is just one small way to shed light on and support Indigenous communities. And so like I said, I'll talk about how to use litigation to protect against the impacts of off-road vehicles. Something I'm going to tie in is people have been talking about the harms and the impacts and the data and the photographs showing all of these harms. And instead, litigation is one tool. Legal tools also include advocacy. So I'm going to talk about that, like how to use some of that data that Marilyn was demonstrating, those high risk ponds, how to use that in advocacy and tying it to legal standards, right, to try to force some change short of litigation. Usually litigation is kind of the backstop, the last resort. So many people have already talked about the harms and the impacts from off-road vehicles. But just briefly, so natural resource damage, you've got aquatic and terrestrial impacts, harassment of wildlife, so direct collisions or displacement on top of impacts to the habitat, and then disruption of wildlife habitat, and finally the conflicts with non-motorized uses. So George Werthener at the beginning talked about how the impacts to non-motorized users are disproportionately felt. And you can imagine if you were in an otherwise quiet forest, out west, a lot of people ride horses on the trails. If you're riding along and you come around a corner and you're faced by a surprise of like a motorbike coming down the trail, right? That impact to you is very different than the impact to the motorbike who is creating the noise in an otherwise quiet landscape. So conflicts with non-motorized uses can really transform quiet landscapes, and Guardians works both in the summer travel management sector, but also on winter travel management aspects. And in the winter, you've got wildlife that are particularly vulnerable to noise and other, disruptions to an otherwise very quiet landscape in the winter. So thinking about litigation, but I actually switched it to legal tools because, like I said, litigation is one option. However, there's other ways to use the law and use legal tools to push for changes on a landscape. And my work does focus on off-road vehicles on federal lands. So that is the focus of my talk, but I will tie in New Jersey aspects. This photo is of the North Fork Crooked River on the Ochiko National Forest in Oregon. That's not one of my case examples, but on this landscape, we did avert an off-road vehicle project that would have added over 130 miles of new OHV routes on this fragile, it's a dry landscape. So any time you are dealing with off-road vehicles on federal lands, there are several environmental statutes that come into play to protect against the harms from off-road vehicle use. The key one is the National Environmental Policy Act. And in New Jersey, so talking about Pinelands, you're talking about state forests and the state environmental agencies. New Jersey does have, and y'all probably know this, Executive Order 215 that was signed into law, or that was signed in 1989 by former New Jersey Governor Keene, and so serves as the State Environmental Policy Act. So some similar processes there in terms of providing an avenue for public involvement in a decision-making process. And so on the federal side, you have the National Environmental Policy Act with the notice and comment periods for public involvement, and also an opportunity to really advocate for the changes you want. Another key here is using that process. So when you are provided a public opportunity for notice or comment, to bring those photos, bring those maps, the data that demonstrates the impacts of off-road vehicles on the land, because a lot of times, unless the decision maker happens to recreate in that area or is a fan of ORV or use, hopefully not, unless they know, it's hard to get a sense just in describing what the impacts are. And then that also helps build an administrative record, which both on the state or the federal side is really important if you do anticipate needing litigation in the future, right? So building a record that demonstrates the harms and makes it harder for an agency to make a decision to add off-road vehicle use to a landscape, and hopefully push them into a different trajectory of reducing the motor vehicle use on the land. Executive Order 11644 was signed in 1972 by President Nixon. So that's again on the federal level and applies to the designation of off-road vehicle use on federal lands. So both, you'd be thinking about Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service lands. And in general, that executive order sets a management regime where everything is closed to off-road vehicle use unless the agencies designate the route or area as open. And that's important because before these executive orders, a lot of the national forests and the BLM lands were open unless designated closed, which meant people could ride anywhere. So it's a big shift in management approach. We're still using that particular executive order a lot in litigation because the agencies tend not to follow through on that duty to implement a closed unless designated open management approach. And then finally, the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act. So any federal agency that is designating for motorized use on federal lands would be triggering the Clean Water Act if there's waters of the US on that landscape. And also if there are listed species, either threatened or endangered species or designated critical habitat on the landscape, they might have to think about processes under the Endangered Species Act. Under the Clean Water Act, it would be the requirement to not cause or contribute to a violation of water quality standards. I will note that for the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act, it doesn't just apply to federal agencies. So these would apply equally to your state or local agencies or private individuals, right? If you have waters that are being impacted and causing or contributing to a violation of those state water quality standards. So real briefly, black letter law, and then I'm going to talk about 3 case examples. So National Environmental Policy Act, there's a citation for the federal law. It requires a detailed statement for a major federal action significantly affecting the environment. And the purpose is to foster informed decision-making. Courts have referred to this statute as a look before you leap type approach, right? So that you have wise decision-making, but not just the decision makers are informed, also so that the public can be informed about what's happening on these public lands. And then the detailed statement needs to address the impacts and also reasonable alternatives to any proposal, which courts have referred to as like a hard look. that agencies take a hard look at taking an action before they approve it. National Forest Management Act applies to the Forest Service, and the Federal Land Policy and Management Act applies to the Bureau of Land Management. Both set these like multiple use mandates and also requirements that any site-specific actions like designating an area or a route for motorized use is consistent with any governing management plan. For the Forest Service, that'd be a forest plan. For the Bureau of Land Management, that would be a RMP. I'm going to forget these acronyms, but the governing plan the site-specific designations need to be consistent with those governing plans. And then I already mentioned the executive orders, and the executive orders really set the closed unless designated open, but also require any designations be made with the objective of minimizing impacts to natural resources, wildlife, and wildlife habitat, and also conflicts with other uses. And so the executive orders, we often rely on them for that last aspect, which is called the minimization criteria. And so that applies to any designations on federal lands. The Endangered Species Act requires any federal agency to ensure that the action authorized is not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of an endangered or threatened species or result in the destruction or adverse modification of critical habitat. Section 9 is a prohibition on taking, harming, harassing, etc., of any listed species. And so how this applies to New Jersey, I looked up, there's a list of the threatened and endangered species within the state, and just a couple of them are the bog turtle is listed as threatened, Indian bat is listed as endangered, and the northeastern beach tiger beetle is listed as threatened. Those are just a couple, there's a lot more, there's like 4 or 5 plants. And so if those are implicated in any of the areas, right, there is that prohibition under Section 9 of the Endangered Species Act to not take that listed entity. Okay, so I'm going to jump into case examples. So to give you a sense of like how guardians and our partners have used the legal requirements as kind of bedrock environmental laws as a standard to help protect against the impacts from off-road vehicle use. So my first case example involves sage grouse in California and Nevada. And the case is Sierra Trail Dogs Motorcycle and Recreation Club versus U.S. Forest Service. And in this case, the motorcycle clubs and associations filed a complaint against the Forest Service because the Forest Service had decided to amend the Humboldt-Toyabe National Forest's forest plan and add a new standard to protect the bi-state sage grouse distinct population segment. So sage grouse is the broader species, right? And the distinct population segment at issue here was the bi-state sage grouse. And off-road vehicle use was causing a threat to the extinction of the bird, in particular because these birds use what's called a lek, L-E-K, and it's an area of sage grouse of sagebrush where the bird needs to show off its feathers and do its ritual. And so that was key. That area and protecting that area is key. And if you have off-road vehicles driving through that, right, you're going to disrupt the ritual, but also disrupt the reproductive success of the birds. And so the Forest Service had initially proposed through the NEPA process a 1/4 mile buffer around those leks. And then in its final decision, going through the NEPA process, and the Forest Service has an objection process, so further administrative process, the Forest Service actually increased that to a 4-mile buffer. And the motorists were upset about that, right? Because that means no motorized use within that 4-mile buffer. And the motorized groups challenged that change as a significant change from the proposed action. And so that they claimed it required a supplemental NEPA analysis. And conservation groups, including Wild Earth Guardians, intervened in support of the Forest Service's decision. And we were represented by Western Watersheds Project and the Stanford Law Clinic at the Stanford's Environmental Law School. And the U.S. District Court found in favor of the Forest Service. It determined that the 4-mile buffer was within the range of alternatives that the Forest Service had originally considered. And so it didn't need a supplemental NEPA analysis. And this case really illustrates the importance of advocacy during that administrative process, right? Through the notice and comment and objection process, not only were the advocates, the conservation groups, successful in getting an increased buffer from 1/4 mile to 4 miles, but also it created an administrative record that supported the agency's decision against a legal challenge by the motorized groups. And so really highlights Jason's point about public sentiment, getting buy-in from the land managers were the target there, right? The people making the decisions. I will say, I don't think it would have been possible, and it certainly wasn't necessary to get the motorized groups to buy in to that buffer, but it did help build a stronger administrative record that was defensible in court. And then also those protections against the off-road vehicle impacts for sage grouse protected all other animals and wildlife within those areas surrounding Lex. So it had broader implications. The second case example I have is protecting wilderness quality lands. And this is the Bitterroot Ridge Runners Snowmobile Club versus Forest Service. And this is out of Montana District Court and then was appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And the big concern here was the Forest Service had issued a 2016 travel plan, kind of designating areas for motorized use and also mechanized use, mountain bikes, on the Bitterroot National Forest, which is in Montana and Idaho. And the motorized and mechanized groups challenged the travel plan because it had closed certain wilderness quality lands. So recommended wilderness and wilderness study areas were closed under the travel plan to motorized use and mechanized use. So off-road vehicles and mountain bikes could no longer go in these wilderness study areas or recommended wilderness. And that was to protect the wilderness characteristics of those lands. Under Montana Wilderness Study Act, the agencies have a duty, there's case law supporting that the agencies have a duty to protect those wilderness characteristics. And the agencies determined that the off-road vehicles and the mechanized use, the mountain bikes, would detract from those wilderness characteristics. And so the district, again, Wild Earth Guardians was among a coalition that intervened in support of the Forest Service's decision. So again, persuading and advocating for a good decision and then going to court to defend it based on that administrative record. And the Ninth Circuit affirmed the Court of Appeals decision that those lands should be closed. And those lands also, the surveys had shown there were groups, Wolverine Watchers was a group that had done surveys and documented wolverine within those wilderness study areas. So it was important for a lot of wildlife, but in particular at the time, a proposed species for protection. And I think I have time to do one final case. Do I have time, Jacqueline? One final case example?
Go for it, Marla.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So the final case example involves protecting bull trout in Washington state. And this is an active case. So I'm just going to speak to the filings that are public. But in this case, it's Conservation Northwest versus US Forest Service, and Wild Earth Guardians and Conservation Northwest are co-plaintiffs challenging the Forest Service's decision to open 117 miles of forest roads to wheeled all-terrain vehicles, WATVs, to add another acronym to the OHV, ORV grouping. But in this case, the Forest Service made that change without going through NEPA, without claiming a categorical exclusion, without saying, this is something we can do without NEPA. They just did it without any process and without going through ESA consultation. So without doing the Endangered Species Act assessment. And bull trout were one of many species impacted by these changes in designations. So it also included Canada lynx were in the areas where these roads were changed to open for WATVs, grizzly bear, woodland caribou's habitat. They're not really in Washington anymore, unfortunately, but what should be woodland caribou recovery areas were opened to WATVs, and then also the threatened western yellow-billed cuckoo. So lots of species. It was kind of, it was actually surprising to see them not go through NEPA and the ESA process. But as many people have already mentioned today, the impacts from WATV use, not only in waters, but these are roads crossing waterways, adjacent to waterways. And so lots of potential impacts to bull trout. And the goal of that case is to ensure compliance with NEPA and the Endangered Species Act, mainly to allow for public participation in the process. Without the normal process, there's no way to do the advocacy and to highlight the concerns about species or impacts to non-motorized uses. And one thing to note too is that these routes were identified by a tri-state county commission, so outside of the normal federal public process, and they were specifically designed to create loops and scenic routes that these groups were planning to do events on, right? So it wasn't just like a little addition here and there. They were actually trying to increase the interest in WATV use on the Colville in these specific areas. So I guess to close, my parting message is that Forest Watch is really important. Getting all of that data, the mapping, the information to demonstrate a need for different changes in management of the land to prevent those impacts from off-road vehicles is key. And I think people have already mentioned that they need volunteers, but yeah, just another plug that Forest Watch is a really important aspect of ensuring that OHV use is somewhat cabined, or the impacts of it are somewhat cabined. And that's it.
That was great. Thank you so much, Marla. And thanks for the work that you do. Could you tell us more about Forest Watch?
Oh, that's just a term, right? Like just Forest Watch. Out here, it's mostly national forests that Guardians is tracking projects on. So while y'all are looking at the Pinelands, out here we're looking at national forests. And so I refer to it as kind of a Forest Watch, especially like I live next to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. So keeping eyes and ears open for any of that kind of damage, and then documenting it when you do see it can be really helpful.
Marla, thank you very much. By the way, thank you for your beginning where you recognized Native Americans and the damage that we've done to them. I had a question that Pinelands is a national reserve, actually. It's a kind of federal state partnership. And I was just curious whether you knew anything about how that would work legally. Like, in other words, can a national reserve take action individually? Does it have to be all national reserves do the same thing? That's not something I know much about, even though I work for the commission. And so I, know something about like our comprehensive management plan and what we do as a commission.
Yeah, I haven't worked with national reserves before. So if anyone else on this call has, that might be helpful. But in terms of, looking at who is taking an action and is there an action, right? Like on the legal side, we'd look for, is there a federal agency action? So to the extent that a federal agency is either providing funding or authorizing something, then that might be where you would trigger NEPA. But then also, like I mentioned, you've got the New Jersey executive order that does some environmental processes as well. But I don't know, Jason, do you know if there's other federal entities?
Well, it's a complicated issue because the federal entities don't have a lot of actual decision-making power within the Pinelands as of now. Forsyth National Wildlife Refuge is within the Pinelands, but the lands that they possess are relatively untouched by ORVs, except for, a few significant areas. And they really aren't creating any actions or expanding ORV use, for example. Most of what we're dealing with is in land within the reserve, so designated by the National Parks and Recreation Act of 1978, but not managed by the federal government. It's managed by the state government, by and large, the public land.
Yeah, let me just add a couple of thoughts. This is Emile DeVito. The National Park Service has a representative on the Pinelands Commission. One of the 15 commissioners is designated by the National Park Service, is a federal Park Service employee. Usually it's the administrator of the Philadelphia National Park Service office. But we do have, the Clean Water Act, and then New Jersey, of course, has assumed the 404 program under the Clean Water Act, so that New Jersey administers the Clean Water Act in New Jersey. But certainly, many of these activities in wetlands that occur on state lands are, I would think, illegal under the Clean Water Act. It all gets back to who's responsible for it. And, again, I think I mentioned this earlier on in the talk today. The Pinelands Commission, right, has documented these hundreds of ponds that I can't remember what you said right now, Marilyn, but there are maybe a couple of hundred ponds that have been damaged, and 400 of them at high risk, almost 400 of them at high risk of being damaged. And if the state, who owns most of them, is only trying to fix 1 or 2 per year, does that constitute negligence? Does that constitute some type of gross negligence under the Clean Water Act? Is the state responsible? I don't know. Can somebody win a lawsuit against the state of New Jersey for being negligent and allowing its natural resources to be destroyed under, it's certainly a violation of the regulations of the Pinelands Act. Any landowner, if a landowner went and destroyed a wetlands, they would get a notice of violation from the Pinelands Commission. Has the state gotten a notice of violation from the Pinelands Commission since it's allowing wetlands to be destroyed? I don't know. I don't think so. I think this all needs to be investigated, because I don't think the state should be allowed to just say, well, they don't have the resources to protect their natural resources. Not when those are actual violations that are occurring. I don't know legally, what can be done about it, but it's something that should be investigated to find out if we do have a legal approach. There is a federal act, there's a state act, there's a federal Clean Water Act, New Jersey has its own Endangered Species Act, which ostensibly protects endangered animal species and threatened animal species. And, take has occurred. We know that take has occurred on state land because of off-road vehicle activity. We have hard evidence of it. I mean, there's a whole realm of things that really need to be investigated, because I understand that the state has limited resources, but I don't think it's a viable excuse, personally.
Well, perhaps this will serve as a launching point for that investigation.
It might be useful to look at the states that have banned ORV activity and find out what they did. Like, what was their process? I doubt state officials were welcoming the opportunity. They probably had to be persuaded and pushed.
Well, I mean, these things are all, the state has banned all these illegal activities that we're talking about. Technically, you're only allowed to ride a registered motor vehicle on a designated roadway. The Pinelands Commission has a regulation about that, and at least for Wharton State Forest. But even so, there, what Fred Akers talked about early on, those regulations still apply. You're not allowed to do any of these things under the rules for state parks and forests. But, nothing's happening about it. So, I mean, it really, and, every time every discussion today keeps coming back to the point that, yeah, we can try to do a lot of good things, but unless we have enforcement, we're not going to get ahead of the problem. So I think it's time that we have to all put our heads together and figure out, what the legal process is, and hold the state's feet to the fire, because, and I know the state has many problems and, a lack of money and a lack of personnel, but it shouldn't matter.
But I think that's ultimately why this ban needs to take place. In other words, I presume the White Mountains, was it the White Mountains? probably they had the same situation that we have, where they restricted things and then people were still destroying things. And then finally they had to say, no, you can't go anywhere. And ultimately, it seems like if you, at least my takeaway from today is that's the only way to stop it, is to ban it altogether. You know, there are just too many rogue elements that are too destructive.
Right. Well, I know Jason might be able to speak to this better, or someone else on the call, but I think there was an announcement by the New Jersey Division of Fish and Wildlife that certain areas are going to be closed to everyone indefinitely because too much destruction is occurring. So that it's not a question of, are you in there with an off-road vehicle? You can't even go in there to bird watch right now, which, you know, that would certainly get people's attention if the net was cast over such a wide group, you know, that even responsible people can't go and use our public lands. You know, frankly, I applaud the decision, but you know, if it's done on a wide basis, it's going to cause a tremendous uproar. And if it's done on, you know, if it's kept that way for a long time, it's going to cause a tremendous uproar, especially when hunting season comes along.
Okay, so we're going to launch into the group discussion, and then just going to start off with some quick polling questions. I'm just going to launch the poll. So for everybody on the call in the Zoom meeting, please respond to the poll questions that we're launching now.
That question went away.
Once you vote, it might.
No, I didn't vote.
Okay. Well, there'll be more.
You know, it's on my screen still.
It was on my, maybe I accidentally voted.
Maybe you did. I was going to say.
Oh, God help me.
Paula, you probably said it wasn't important.
Yeah, that would be fair.
And you know, while we're waiting for a couple more people to respond, you know, we can start thinking about questions and discussion points. You know, where do we want to go from here? What do you find yourself thinking about this topic and you know, public lands management, enforcement in general? Where do we go from here, everyone?
Jason, I really liked what you said about giving people something positive rather than something negative. In general, I think the positive approach works. I mean, sometimes you need to be very negative, right? You know, but I also read that in general, campaigns are more successful if they highlight the accomplishments. So in other words, campaigns that just show people a bunch of muddy ponds and like, this is awful, we have to do something about it, are not going to be as successful as ones like your before and after that are like, look, we succeeded in restoring this pond.
Jason, it shows the poll's closed.
Yes, I did close it. Yeah. So I'm going to ask the second question, which is, what issues are the most challenging in the area in which you work or live?
While we're waiting, Jason, this is Emile DeVito. I think we need to find private money. You know, I think we need to somehow find a collection of individuals who have a lot of resources, who might be rare plant enthusiasts or rare animal enthusiasts or certain types of foundations that focus on endangered species. I think we need to raise a few $1,000,000 and bring money to the table to help the state do, you know, management of these high-risk sites. And at the same time, I think we need to figure out a way to hold the state's feet to the fire legally. I think, you know, I don't think there's any reason why the nonprofits can't be good cops and bad cops at the same time. But, you know, we're not going to get the money. We're not going to get public money for this, not especially after COVID and all the entrenched problems we have with so many issues in New Jersey with, you know, things that don't have to do with plants and butterflies and snakes and turtles. So I think we have to find private money and somehow find people who are concerned about these groups of animals and plants and who have the resources to help us out. I don't know how to do it, but I bet we can do it if we try.
Hey, Emile, this is Jessica. Do you think we could go get Subaru involved in this and get them, because they show sort of nice, sort of genteel off-roading in their ads, but maybe we could turn them around. Maybe we could get them to do something a little bit more positive. I mean, I see all these off-road, all these.
Those are the kind of ideas. Those are the kind of ideas we need to pursue for sure.
Emile, this is Paula. Just quickly, I think we've done everything we can in a positive way, in a working together way. And I think the only way the DEP or the governor is going to pay any attention is the litigation. I think they need to be sued.
In these situations, a lot of times I think about Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Some of you are probably too young to remember when drunk driving was a totally acceptable thing. But when I was growing up, it was no big deal, and it was no big deal if you even killed somebody. And Mothers Against Drunk Driving changed all that with this intense public campaign. And I do believe officials respond to PR. If we can get the PR to switch to the idea that, people don't have a right to, run through the national forest or state forest and, be destructive. I think the politicians will follow that. Right now, the loudest voices and the best funded voices are on the side of the ORVs. And I just think the general public isn't really very interested in this issue, but that doesn't mean you can't get them interested.
I have a question about the survey question. The option number 3, eliminate undesignated legacy roads and paths. Could you explain what you had in mind with that?
Yeah, one strategy is to simply remove these paths, replant paths and roads created from logging and extractive industry use so that they become unavailable for off-road vehicle use, and so that the inner lands that they access are not quite as accessible to RV use.
How much does that cut down on general accessibility for hikers too, though?
Well, I think that's an important question, and a lot of these could be redesignated as hiking or biking paths, which, especially in the Pinelands, and I know in national forests, there are many thousands hundreds of miles in the Pinelands, thousands of miles in national forests that were created for logging and other industry that really serve no purpose today, and so are used as off-road vehicle routes. Some of those perhaps could be converted for other, more agreeable uses, and perhaps some, and there is some work to do this now, should just be removed.
All right, thank you.
And there's a few big efforts underway with NJDEP. Emile in New Jersey, Emile referenced the closures of certain areas of wildlife management areas in New Jersey, which is managed by the Fish and Wildlife Department, New Jersey Fish and Wildlife. And this was really a move of desperation. They could not control the activities, which were mainly off-road vehicles, bonfires. I've seen burning vehicles, hundreds of people with ORVs, fist fights, like just total craziness. So, they were really at a point of desperation and had to just completely close these areas to the public. Personally, I don't view that as a really an ideal solution. I think we should take a look at an area, and most of these are former sand mines, so former resource extraction areas, and take a look at this area and say, what can this be? Can this be a park? Can this be even a mountain bike park? Can this be, a dispersed camping area? What can we give an official designation to the space to, so that it isn't overwhelmed with other activities like ORV use that, really are just not appropriate anywhere in the state? And then DEP should be launching a new effort soon, hopefully soon, to investigate the creation of a permit system, specifically beginning with Wharton State Forest, Now, Wharton, they had a really great plan in 2015 to designate routes, what you can drive on, what you can't drive on. That was pulled back on after, kind of an unfortunate messaging campaign that DEP went on. They basically shot themselves in the foot going to different, forcing the superintendent to go to different municipalities and kind of created their own opposition. So instead of, talking about the great things that can be done, creating new hiking trails, they focused on the ban. No, we're not, you won't be able to do this. We need to really focus on what we can do, what people will be able to do, the expansion of opportunities and availability of recreation that people can do that is also compatible with the land. So, in this new effort that DEP is undergoing to create a permit system, I think we really need to focus on the positives, and it should apply to everyone and not just for people using Jeeps and trucks. But for everyone going to the backcountry, they should pay a small fee, and that'll help the state forest both control the entrance to the land, because there's so many legacy routes that there's maybe 400 different entrances into Wharton State Forest, whereas in somewhere like Yellowstone, you might have four entry and exit points, which you can't control space if you can't control who comes in and who leaves. So what other questions are there? What other questions does everyone have?
I have a comment and also a question.
Go ahead, Russell.
My comment is that I think that there's a lot more that we could be doing to move toward more enforcement. And I think we could do all kinds of things like circulate petitions, circulate sign-on letters, have regular face-to-face meetings with law enforcement officials, and get the press more directly involved. And I think that we probably go a long ways toward what we want if we could just get the existing laws and regulations enforced. And then my question is to Marilyn, since the Pinelands Commission has been doing this long-term monitoring, I just wonder if there are any data that have been collected about, when we do succeed in blocking ORV traffic in an area that has been badly impacted, is there any way we can measure, the success in that area, restoring? I mean, obviously, if we stop traffic in a pond, we see vegetation come back, but do we know if the same diversity is coming back or the same quality of habitat? For example, if there were rare plants in the pond, do they come back? Or do we, tend to get like a monoculture of some common plant coming back, that sort of thing? And I don't want to focus entirely on wetlands, because obviously there's a lot of upland areas that have been really badly impacted as well.
Well, actually, I would say the issue about doing a study like that is the same for both wetlands and uplands, which is to really do it right, you'd have to get it before it was impacted in the first place. Because even if you were to look at the wetland and sort of see if it returns to same pH, let's say, or specific conductance or whatever you might be measuring, you really wouldn't know how much it was affected by the disturbance, right? So,
yeah. Well,
and so I think that's part of what's stopped the Pinelands Commission, so if we started monitoring ponds and then some disturbance came into those ponds, that would be an excellent opportunity for us to see what kind of changes occurred and what would happen once you protected the pond again, right? So that nobody could come in. But we haven't really been in a situation like that, at least not yet.
Okay, so that's why I prefaced it with, the long-term monitoring program that the commission is doing. I thought just maybe there are some places where the long-term monitoring program has captured some data prior to the either the ORV activity or the attempt to restore a place.
Well, there
like
are a couple of ponds that I know of at the moment that we have been measuring for a long time. And so I think we probably have measurements that took place before ORV activity, occurred. But those ponds at the moment are in areas that are incredibly open. Like, it would be extremely expensive to put a fence around them. You know what I mean? And we haven't, right? So at the moment they're not protected. So you can't see what's happening with them being restored. But that's very few and far between. Most of the ponds that we're monitoring are not high-risk ponds.
Okay.
Can I just put one more thing out there? We've documented all this to death, and we've tried working with DEP, and we tried being nice here and there. And it took, well, when I spent 30 years in government, and if the governor wants something, it happens. I mean, we could try to make this happen. But if the governor takes an interest in it, and the governor says to the DEP, I want this to happen, it's going to happen. How do we get our governor, who has never even mentioned the Pine Barrens? I've never heard him mention it. Doesn't appear to care at all. How do we get him to care about this? How do we get him to say to DEP, to say to everybody, I want this situation taken care of? I mean, he's very focused on climate change, and he loves that, but he doesn't seem to even know the Pinelands are in the state that he's governing. How do we get him to feel an obligation to us, or that he has to listen to us and he has to do something, speak?
Well, I mean, we have an election coming up. Maybe we can try to get it on his radar screen as part of a platform, maybe by working especially through the Attorney General, who did seem to take an interest in it.
Okay.
That's a suggestion, And the other thing I was going to say is just getting back to Marilyn's study and Russell's question. Marilyn, you showed excavated ponds had a lot of species diversity of native plants. I presume they were native plants that
Yes,
you had in your table?
yes. We found that, natural and excavated ponds were not all that different. I mean, there were slightly, I guess you might say, better, more natural values, like lower pH in natural ponds, but they were very similar.
So, I mean, that kind of indicates that if an excavated pond, which starts off pretty much like some sort of a mud hole, ages ago, no doubt, right? These probably excavated ponds were, from activities in the Pine Barrens, some of them from, over 100 years ago. But nevertheless, man-made ponds that were just dirt tossed around, right, did eventually attract rare species. So that's somewhat indicative that these things can restore themselves over time. It might not be on the time scale that we're going to be able to see, like if we know that there's a rare pond, a natural pond with rare species, and it gets devastated by ORVs, we might not live to see those rare species come back. We might, but we might not. But there's a good chance, the way the Pine Barren seems to operate, that sooner or later rare species show up.
One of the most amazing things about the Pine Barrens is its resilience. It's really quite incredible. And it actually takes a great deal to kind of overwhelm a part of the Pine Barrens with invasive species and to disturb it to the point where it can't return. And so I think that's a positive for us in that we can restore these things. And the pond that Jason showed looked great after 4 years. So I think all of this is actually well within our lifetimes, but it's certainly possible with certain kinds of rare plants that it's not. I do want to mention, by the way, that my plant, Ringcospora kearney, is a federally threatened species that grows in wetlands. Anytime you guys want me to do a survey, I am happy to come out on a weekend and check it out.
That's good news, Marilyn. Hey, just on that topic, have you ever been to the Hamilton Preserve in Mays Landing?
That sounds vaguely familiar.
It's Riga Natural Heritage Priority Site on New York Avenue in Hamilton
Yes,
Township?
right. I think I've been there, yeah.
So I've heard that was once,
right?
I've heard that was once the largest site for your plant there.
Okay. Well, one thing I will say about Rincospora nieskerniae, you can't always say because it kind of disappears that it's because somebody did something bad. It actually is a very ephemeral plant and it has a tendency to go in and out. It also does seem to benefit a great deal from fire. So if it's in a place where for a very long time there's no fire, it will probably just decrease naturally for various reasons, which I could go into on a different forum. So.
Jason, you're muted if you're talking.
Oh, yes. So I just wanted to, leave one more opportunity out there for questions comments before we wrap things up. But I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. I thought it was very productive, and all the presenters I think were wonderful. And I hope, especially after our poll results, it seems like we should do this more often. And perhaps, we can think of more formats, different formats going forward, and how this can work better as a collaborative, approach to moving this topic, this issue along. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. And if you have final comments, please say them now.
Mm-hmm. I will say there were a number of good comments in chat. Thank you for that. And thank you everyone for sticking around for the almost entirety of this forum. I know some people had to drop off, and just so people know, there were about 30 people on YouTube consistently throughout this time. So I would say overall this has been a very good attendance with like a total of about 70 people participating, which is great. And thank you, Jason, for pulling together the speakers.
Yeah, and we will make this recording available as a resource moving forward. I think, a lot of people, working on these topics will find this very useful, especially all the great presenters.
Yes,
so great.
Another thank you to all the presenters. And one nice thing about COVID is, this idea of having an online virtual forum and having these speakers from other places, like it really made it much easier. So that was a plus. And thanks to various people that participated today from different agencies, nonprofits, et cetera. I think it made it nice to have a mix of different individuals that got to hear this information and participate in the discussion.
So I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day today. Maybe get outside and take a walk after this long meeting, and we'll do our best to move this thing along and make more progress. All right.
Really appreciate.
Yeah, it was great, man. Good job to everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Good seeing you.